Welcome to another quiet journey into the past, a slow unraveling of forgotten customs, distant lives, and the gentle hum of human history. Tonight, we will drift backward into a world where love was not swiped or searched for, but arranged, whispered about, and carefully brokered under the watchful eyes of tradition. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let your room settle into stillness. If you enjoy these calming explorations of olden days, feel free to subscribe. Only if it brings you peace. Tell us where and when you're listening from in the comments if you'd like. Now, close your eyes, or soften your gaze. Let your mind loosen from the present, and allow yourself to drift into the quiet rhythm of history. Tonight, we explore what dating, or something like it, was really like in medieval times. To begin to understand love and courtship in the medieval world, one must first release the modern image of dating entirely. No letters sealed with longing, no romantic walks through the countryside, and certainly no candlelit dinners between two people choosing each other freely. The medieval landscape, both physical and cultural, did not make room for love in the way we often imagine it now. Instead, the journey to companionship was more transactional, more structured, and almost always tangled with the roots of land, inheritance, and status. In rural villages scattered across the fields of France, England, and the Germanic states, young people did not fall in love as an act of rebellion or adventure. They met, if they were fortunate, at communal spaces such as markets, religious festivals, or harvest celebrations. But even then, their meetings were not entirely casual. Everything was overseen by parents, by the church, by the norms of a tightly woven social fabric that had little tolerance for open flirtation. The rhythms of the seasons guided more than the planting of barley and rye. They also shaped the calendar of romantic possibility. Spring was often the time when communities allowed young people more freedom to mingle. A brief window when the labor of planting was done and the world felt new again. This was when local festivals were held, when May Day dances were permitted, and when the youth might, for once, spend time together without the constant watch of a priest or parent. But even here, the customs were thick with symbolism. In England, the tradition of going a-maying involved groups of young men and women venturing into the woods to gather flowers, supposedly to decorate the village, though the subtext of romantic pursuit was well understood and not always approved. Still, it would be a mistake to imagine that such gatherings led to casual courtship. In a society governed by hierarchy and tradition, marriage was rarely about affection. It was about consolidating land, about preserving a family name, about producing children who could survive long enough to tend to animals, pay tithes, and pass on the same narrow patch of earth to another generation. Love, or even liking, was not guaranteed. For the peasantry, whose lives were ruled by survival, marriage was practical. A young man needed to prove he could work a field, repair a roof, or plow a muddy road before a father would allow his daughter to be promised. In some regions, this was literal. There were tests of strength or labor imposed on suitors. In others, it was economic. A dowry needed to be paid. A cow, a pig, a few sacks of barley. The courtship, if it could be called that, was a negotiation. Among the nobility, dating did not exist at all in the modern sense. Instead, alliances were orchestrated by families, often before the couple had even met. Girls of noble birth could be promised by the age of 7, sometimes younger. The promise was a legal bond, often sealed with property or titles, that would tie two families together and hopefully prevent war, secure a border, or gain influence at court. These marriages might not take place until the girl was older, perhaps 14 or 15, but they were rarely about her wishes. She was a piece on a board, moved by fathers, uncles, and sometimes kings. Still, even within these tight boundaries, human emotion found ways to flicker. Troubadours composed songs of courtly love, not about the real marriages of their patrons, but about yearning for the unattainable, the forbidden, the idealized. These songs told of knights pining for noble ladies, of pure longing untainted by physical desire or domestic duty. These were fantasies, of course, but they became part of the cultural landscape, influencing how people, especially the educated, thought about affection. A young woman in a castle might never choose her husband, but she might read verses by de Troyer and imagine something softer than obligation. In rural settings, there were folk traditions that allowed for subtle signaling of interest. A girl might drop her spindle where a boy was likely to pass. A boy might leave a carved token near the village well. There was symbolism in bread, in ribbons, in how hay was stacked. It was all coded, quiet, deniable, and often unnoticed by those who were not meant to see. These were not declarations. They were gestures, small enough to be disavowed if needed, but powerful in their own way. And when two young people did manage to marry with affection, or at least with a liking, they might whisper that it was God's will, not their own. Because in many places, to say you married for love was to invite suspicion. It meant you had defied your family. It meant you valued your heart over your duty. The church, ever present and ever watchful, tried to control romantic customs as much as it controlled feast days and funerals. It taught that marriage was sacred, but that lust was sinful. It allowed for affection between spouses, but only if it remained orderly, reproductive, and quiet. Even kissers before marriage were condemned by many local priests, who preached about temptation and the slippery road to eternal damnation. And yet, secret kisses happened, not in the moonlight, not dramatically, but in barns, behind trees, in corners of kitchens, when no one was looking. In some communities, there were customs meant to test the compatibility of potential couples. One such tradition, found in parts of Germany and Scandinavia, was called bundling. It involved a man and a woman lying side by side in bed, often fully clothed, and often with a barrier of some sort between them, a board or a tightly wrapped blanket. The point was not physical intimacy, but conversation, a chance to speak, to gauge character, to see if marriage might be tolerable. Of course, the line between tolerance and temptation was thin, and not all bundling stayed pure. Still, it reflected a recognition that spending time together, even in a society so governed by rules, mattered. Elsewhere, trials of affection were tied to local superstitions. A girl might throw a piece of cake over her shoulder at a festival to see if it landed in the shape of a heart. A boy might place a flower under his pillow on St. Agnes's Eve and pray for a vision of his future bride. These customs existed alongside the practicalities of dowries and contracts, suggesting that, even in the most rigid systems, people longed for signs, for magic, for hope, for something beyond obligation. It is important to understand, too, that not all unions were equal, and not all women had the same agency. A widow might have more freedom to choose her next husband, especially if she had property of her own. A servant girl, on the other hand, might be at the mercy of her master's intentions. In cities, where anonymity offered a kind of freedom, clandestine affairs were more common, though they were still dangerous. Reputation was currency, especially for women. A rumor could ruin a future. A glance could invite disgrace. And so, flirtation had to be woven into daily life with incredible care. A smile held too long, a touch disguised as help, a shared apple. The language of love was quiet, symbolic, and heavily constrained, but it existed. Through poetry, gesture, and ritual, people reached for connection in whatever ways they could. And sometimes, against the odds, a marriage would grow into something tender, not romantic, perhaps, not passionate, but filled with patience, mutual survival, and small, daily kindnesses. That, in its own way, was a kind of medieval love story, and it was often the best one could hope for. In the tightly ordered world of medieval life, where few things were left to chance, and even fewer to emotion, the idea of romantic pursuit without intervention was nearly unthinkable. The path to marriage and partnership was rarely walked alone. It was a journey navigated through an intricate web of family ties, social obligations, and often the subtle but powerful influences of those whose roles were not officially recognized: neighbors, servants, clergy, and kin. In the world of medieval courtship, matchmaking was both an art and a duty. It was not unusual for parents to begin thinking about potential matches for their children long before those children reached an age of consent. The process was not casual, nor was it based on whether two people shared a spark or a sense of humor. Instead, it was a complex balancing act, weighing property, social rank, political advantage, and sometimes even past favors or feuds. A father might promise his daughter to the son of a fellow landholder to cement a peace or expand his boundaries, and that promise might be made when the children were still in cradles. Among peasants, where land ownership was limited and wealth was measured in livestock and stored grain, the motivations were just as serious, if less grand in scale. A small-holding family might seek to marry their daughter into a slightly more prosperous household, one with 2 oxen instead of 1, or a well-dug root cellar. Such an alliance might secure not only the survival of their daughter, but the easing of their own burdens through shared labor or future inheritance. These negotiations were not always cold. They could be accompanied by sincere hopes for happiness, or at the very least harmony. but they were practical first. Affection, if it came at all, was hoped for after the contract had been sealed. The concept of a go-between, someone who carried messages, gauged interest, and delicately nudged to people toward an understanding, was common in many regions of medieval Europe. This role might be filled by a relative, often an older woman, who was trusted within both families. Sometimes a village priest, aware of both spiritual and social concerns, would assist discreetly. In noble households, it might be a lady-in-waiting or a household steward. These intermediaries often held considerable sway. They were the ones who whispered observations about a young man's steadiness or a girl's gentleness, who reported back on whether a gift had been well received or a glance returned. Their words could accelerate a union or quietly end it before it began. Among the nobility, marriages were rarely left to chance. Entire treaties could hinge on a union between two houses, and the negotiation process could stretch for months or even years. Ambassadors, scribes, and lawyers might be involved, and every clause, from the dowry amount to the exact inheritance rights of future children, would be documented with care. Once the agreement was made, the young couple had little say. The wedding might be celebrated with pomp, but the courtship, if it existed at all, had taken place between adults in back rooms, over parchment, wax seals, and wine. Still, even in this environment of control and structure, there were cracks through which genuine feelings could sometimes emerge. A young couple might meet before their wedding, perhaps at a feast or religious event, and find themselves drawn to one another. If their families had already agreed to the match, then their fondness could bloom openly, though still within the bounds of propriety. If not, then any romantic stirrings were dangerous, a threat to the larger plans being carefully woven by those in power. In some cases, such feelings led to elopements or scandals, but more often, they were quietly smothered, sacrificed for the greater good of lineage and legacy. The role of women in this process was often constrained by social norms, but it was not entirely passive. A noble woman, especially one with land or a strong lineage, might influence the choice of her husband through suggestion, subtle resistance, or alliance with her mother or female relatives. In peasant households, a daughter might plead her case to her father, citing the good reputation or strong arms of the man she favored. While many of these appeals failed, some succeeded, particularly if the proposed match brought practical advantages, or if the family could afford to be flexible. Women also influenced courtship through reputation. A girl who was known to be virtuous, industrious, and kind would be more sought after than one known for sharpness of tongue or laziness in the field. This reputation was not built solely on behavior, but on how others, especially other women, spoke of her. The gossip of neighbors, the comments of older women, and the observations of midwives and churchgoers all contributed to a girl standing in the marriage market. Thus, mothers took care to instruct their daughters on manners, modesty, and the subtle arts of being noticed without seeming forward. In towns and cities, where anonymity was greater and the rules somewhat looser, there was slightly more room for self-directed romance. Markets and churches were common meeting places, and during certain festivals, the separation between the sexes was relaxed. Young people might dance, exchange tokens, or even walk together in public, though always with the understanding that serious intentions must follow. In some towns, a custom called handfasting was observed, a kind of trial marriage where a couple agreed to live together for a set period, usually a year and a day, to test their compatibility. If things went well, the union was made permanent. If not, they parted ways without lasting shame. This practice was more common in the Celtic regions, and was often frowned upon by the church, but it remained part of local tradition for centuries. There were also symbolic rituals meant to signal interest or commitment. One of the most common was the exchange of gifts. A man might offer a piece of embroidered cloth, a small carved object, or a ribbon. The girl, if she accepted, might wear it in her hair or on her sleeve. This was not just decoration. It was a sign, visible to the community, that a courtship had begun. Other customs involved tokens blessed by saints, given during holy days, or woven into garlands for springtime festivals. These acts were small, quiet, and steeped in local belief, but they carried great weight. The church attempted to regulate marriage through canon law, insisting that it be a sacrament entered freely by both parties. In theory, mutual consent was required. A man and woman had to both say, "I do," for the marriage to be valid in the eyes of God. In practice, however, consent could be murky, especially when family pressures were involved. A girl might be coached on what to say, or too frightened to refuse. Still, the Church's insistence on vocal consent did offer a small degree of protection and autonomy, especially for women facing unwanted unions. In some cases, girls used this rule to refuse marriages arranged by their parents, and priests were obliged to uphold their decision, though not without consequences. Friendship networks also played a role in courtship. In villages, peer groups were tidnit, and young people often grew up together. A boy might fall in love with a girl he had known since childhood, and their friends might help facilitate the match by carrying messages, teasing them into interaction, or helping them find moments alone. These friendships could offer support, but they also brought scrutiny. A misstep could become the subject of jokes or rumors, and reputation, once damaged, was difficult to repair. The matchmaking process was further complicated by the existence of social categories that blurred the lines of eligibility. Bastards, or children born out of wedlock, often faced significant barriers to marriage, especially if they lacked a powerful patron or family name. So did orphans, who might be seen as burdens rather than assets. Yet sometimes, these individuals found unexpected matches with widows, with others of uncertain status, or with those willing to look past lineage for the sake of companionship or necessity. In these cases, the role of intermediaries became even more crucial, as they could advocate, soften reputational edges, or simply make introductions that otherwise would not have occurred. Ultimately, medieval dating, if one can even call it that, was not a private pursuit. It was a communal effort, governed by rules both written and unwritten. Every step, from first glance to final vows, was observed, guided, and judged by a network of family, friends, clergy, and tradition. The idea of pursuing love for its own sake was rare and often discouraged. But within these constraints, people still sought connection. They still hoped for warmth in their partnerships, for peace in their homes, and for moments of tenderness within the structures they had inherited. This chapter of history reminds us that while the framework of courtship has changed dramatically over the centuries, the human desire to be known, chosen, and cherished has remained remarkably constant, even when the expression of that desire had to be carefully shaped by the expectations of a watchful world. As courtship unfolded in the Middle Ages, it was not only guided by families and faith, but steeped in a rich undercurrent of folk beliefs, rituals, and symbolic gestures. To the modern eye, the customs surrounding love might seem quaint, perhaps overly cautious, or even a little absurd. Yet to the people of medieval Europe, these traditions were woven into the very fabric of everyday life. Silent but powerful tools for navigating the uncertainties of affection, compatibility, and commitment. The Church provided the official doctrines on marriage and morality, but the beliefs held by villagers, townsfolk, and even the lesser nobility extended far beyond what the pulpit taught. The cultural life of medieval Europe was filled with signs and omens, charms and tokens, quiet gestures that carried the weight of intent or desire. In the absence of open conversation or emotional transparency, these rituals served as bridges, cautious but meaningful paths toward romantic union. One of the most common customs involved the exchange of tokens. These could be simple items, a piece of ribbon, a sprig of rosemary, a carved wooden trinket, but they carried layered meanings. A girl who tied a ribbon around her wrist and offered it to a young man during a feast was not merely sharing an accessory. She was offering a part of herself, a visible signal of trust, and perhaps even availability. The boy, if he accepted, might wear it in his cap or around his sleeve, marking himself as taken, or at least claimed. In parts of France and England, heart-shaped brooches, often made of pewter or copper, were sold at markets during festivals and fairs. Though inexpensive, they were considered potent symbols, and giving one to someone was a public declaration of affection. Among the more affluent, rings and pins were sometimes given instead, often blessed by a priest or pressed against a relic to imbue them with spiritual protection. These items served both as romantic gestures and as safeguards against bad luck or misfortune in love. Superstitions played a central role in the dance of courtship, shaping not only what young people did, but how they interpreted the world around them. It was widely believed that dreaming of certain flowers foretold future romance. Lavender might signal longing, daisies innocence, and poppies a love that would not be returned. Girls were known to place herbs or blossoms under their pillows on particular feast days, in hopes of seeing their future husband in a dream. One such occasion was Saint Agnes's Eve, observed on the night of January 20th. According to folk tradition, a girl who fasted that day and laid down to sleep in silence would be granted a vision of the man she was meant to marry. These visions, though perhaps born from wishful thinking and hunger, were taken seriously by those who experienced them and eagerly recounted to friends and family in the days that followed. Even the act of walking through certain areas could be interpreted as a sign of romantic fate. It was said that if a man and woman crossed paths at a crossroads at sunrise on May Day, they were destined to marry, unless one of them turned away first, in which case the spell would be broken. Crossroads were potent places in medieval belief, sites of magic, mischief, and mystery, and they figured prominently in courtship rituals. Couples might meet there in secret, away from the eyes of neighbors or family, or leave small tokens beneath a stone or at the base of a tree. If the token was later found and accepted, the bond was considered formed, even if no words were ever spoken. These silent exchanges, full of risk and meaning, were a way for people to express desire without breaking the rules of modesty or propriety. Folk traditions varied from region to region, but many shared common threads. In Scandinavian lands, there was a belief that if a girl wore a red string tied around her finger on Midsummer's Eve and danced barefoot through the dew, she would marry within the year. In parts of Germany, young men would place decorated branches, called Maybaum or May trees, outside the homes of girls they admired. The branches were often adorned with ribbons or flowers, and to find one on your doorstep was to receive a public declaration of affection. Acceptance of the gesture might be signaled by placing a candle in the window, while rejection might mean the branch was quietly removed by morning. These acts transformed the everyday landscape into a stage for courtship, where trees, windows, and even dew-laden grass became instruments of romance. The body itself was not exempt from superstition. A rosy complexion, according to many local beliefs, indicated a loving and trustworthy nature. Pale skin, while admired among the upper classes as a sign of nobility, was sometimes viewed with suspicion in rural areas, where it could suggest frailty or deceit. Eye color, too, carried meaning. Blue eyes were associated with loyalty, green with jealousy, brown with warmth. Of course, none of these associations had any scientific basis, but they shaped the way people judged one another and how they imagined compatibility. Physical touch, when allowed, was highly charged. A hand accidentally brushing another's during a dance could set off hours of whispered interpretation among friends. A lingering glance might be reported to one's parents, who would then decide whether it warranted further inquiry. Nothing was casual. Every moment was a potential signal, and every signal came with consequences. In regions where the church's authority was weaker or where pagan traditions remained strong, more elaborate rituals were practiced. These could include love spells, often passed down by wise women or healers, who knew how to craft charms from herbs, stones, or bits of fabric. A sachet placed beneath a boy's pillow might be said to turn his heart toward the girl who made it. In some cases, potions were brewed, though these were more likely to cause stomachaches than romantic passion. Such practices were officially condemned, of course, but they persisted, especially in isolated villages where old beliefs clung tightly to the edges of daily life. Some communities held specific events designed to encourage pairing. In Wales, the tradition of Cael and Mai included evening gatherings where unmarried young people played games, sang, and tested one another in riddles or skill-based contests. Success in these games might lead to further attention, and some villagers even organized what were effectively speed dating events, though no one would have called them that, where each participant spent a short amount of time conversing with a member of the opposite sex before moving on to the next. Meanwhile, across the English countryside, church ales were common social gatherings that served as informal matchmaking opportunities. These events were fundraisers held by parishes and featured food, drink, music, and dancing. Young people could mingle under the protective umbrella of religious fundraising, giving them a rare chance to interact without immediate scrutiny. While the clergy watched carefully, and older villagers often chaperoned, such events nonetheless allowed for fleeting moments of genuine connection, a shared laugh over ale, a brief dance beneath lanterns, a conversation by the fire. The setting was communal, but within it, private hopes flickered. It was during these occasions that many people met the partners they would eventually wed, even if their parents still had to negotiate the formal agreement afterward. Symbolism extended into speech as well. Because direct declarations of love were often taboo, people developed coded language. A reference to the weather might be a veiled comment on mood. Speaking of the moon could imply longing. Complimenting a girl's stitching or a boy's plowing might carry romantic undertones. In poetry, especially among the literate, metaphors of birds, seasons, and flowers were common. A girl might be called a rose, a lark, or a fawn. A boy might be likened to a falcon, a stag, or a sturdy oak. These comparisons were not always flattering, but they were rich with cultural meaning and offered a way to express emotion without breaking decorum. Even food could be part of the courtship process. Sharing bread, offering a specially prepared dish, or exchanging seasonal fruit could all be interpreted as romantic gestures. In some regions, there were beliefs about the magical properties of certain foods, that honey strengthened bonds, or that apples, when shared, foretold marriage. A girl might peel an apple in one long strip and throw it over her shoulder, hoping it would land in the shape of her beloved's. Bread baked with herbs might be given to a potential suitor as both a treat and a test. If he ate it all, it was a sign of interest. If he left it untouched, the message was clear. While these customs may seem whimsical now, they held real power in the hearts of those who practiced them. In a world with few private moments and even fewer opportunities for open courtship, these small acts, a token given, a flower left on a sill, a glance shared across a festival field, were the building blocks of connection. They were the medieval world's quiet language of longing, allowing people to reach toward one another, even when tradition, religion, and duty stood in the way. Over time, some of these practices faded or were absorbed into church-sanctioned rituals. Others evolved, becoming part of the wedding ceremonies that followed. The giving of rings, the scattering of petals, the shared cup of wine. But at their core, they all reflected the same human need: to find someone, to be chosen, and to express affection in ways that could be felt, if not always spoken. In that sense, the people of the medieval world were not so different from us. They simply had fewer words, more rules, and a deeper reliance on gesture, symbol, and belief. And within that quiet framework, they still managed to find love, or at least something like it, in the small, sacred spaces between what was allowed and what was longed for. While the modern imagination often pictures weddings as grand celebrations of love, unity, and joy, the medieval version was more reserved, more pragmatic, more bound by custom, and deeply embedded in both legal frameworks and religious observance. The culmination of courtship, such as it was, did not lead to a spontaneous romantic climax, but to a carefully negotiated agreement, one that involved property, status, expectations, and the solemn approval of community and church alike. In many cases, the wedding itself was not a sudden event, but a conclusion to months or years of planning, discussion, and gradual alignment of circumstances. And though there were certainly moments of festivity, music, and shared meals, the meaning of the occasion was more serious than sentimental, more binding than beautiful. Marriage in medieval Europe was not merely a personal bond between two individuals. It was a social contract, one that linked families together, established legal rights and obligations, and helped stabilize the social structure of the time. Among the lower classes, a marriage helped ensure that land and labor were managed effectively. Among the middle classes, particularly in growing towns and merchant cities, marriage tied together families with commercial interests, reinforcing trust and creating extended networks of economic cooperation. Among the nobility, marriages could change the course of entire regions, securing peace, solidifying alliances, and even determining lines of succession. In every case, the marriage was considered too important to be left to emotion alone. The process began with what was known as a betrothal, a formal agreement between two parties, often arranged and witnessed by parents or guardians. This agreement could be oral or written, and in many regions was considered almost as binding as the marriage itself. Breaking a betrothal without just cause could result in fines, social disgrace, or the need for restitution. A dowry was usually discussed at this stage. This was not simply a gift from the bride's family to the groom's. It was a negotiation, and often a difficult one. The dowry could include money, livestock, household goods, or even land. In exchange, the groom's family might promise a mourning gift or dower, something given to the bride after the marriage to ensure her financial security should she be widowed. These arrangements could become complex, especially when multiple siblings or competing suitors were involved, and it was not uncommon for disputes over dowries to delay or even derail potential marriages. For peasants, the betrothal might be a more informal affair. A handshake before witnesses, a public promise, or a simple exchange of gifts could suffice. In some regions, couples were considered married by consensus alone, meaning that if they declared themselves to be husband and wife and consummated the relationship, the union was valid in the eyes of the church, even without a formal ceremony. This was a controversial point, and one that caused tension between canon law and local customs. While the church increasingly insisted on public priest-led ceremonies, many rural communities clung to older traditions where marriage was more of a personal understanding than a clerical affair. Still, as the centuries progressed, the church gained firmer control over the institution of marriage. By the 12th and 13th centuries, it was generally accepted, at least in Western Europe, that a valid marriage required the mutual consent of both parties, the presence of a priest, and at least a few witnesses. These changes were not only spiritual but also legal. They helped protect women from forced marriages and gave the church greater authority in regulating family life. A priest's blessing became central to the process, and marriages were increasingly held in churches or in front of the church porch, where the ceremony could be seen and confirmed by the community. The wedding day itself, when it finally arrived, was a significant milestone, but it was often less about celebration and more about confirmation. The ceremony was typically brief: a set of vows, the blessing of the union, and sometimes the placing of a ring upon the bride's finger. Rings, while not universal, became increasingly popular in the later medieval period, especially among the wealthier classes. Often made of simple metal, a ring was a powerful symbol of fidelity and permanence. The vows were solemn and formulaic, emphasizing the duties of each party to love, honor, and remain faithful in sickness and in health until death parted them. For many couples, the ceremony took place at the church door, a symbolic threshold between the sacred and the secular. Afterward, the pair might enter the church together for mass, or in simpler weddings, proceed to their home or village hall for the celebrations that followed. The community often participated in these festivities. There would be food, plain in poor communities, more elaborate in wealthy ones, and perhaps music, dancing, or games. Guests brought gifts, which could be practical items like pots, blankets, or dried goods. In noble households, minstrels might perform, and feasting could last for days, though even the grandest wedding rarely resembled the romanticized images of modern times. In some traditions, particularly in Northern Europe, a ritual known as bedding the bride followed the wedding feast. This custom involved leading the couple to the marital bed, often accompanied by songs, teasing, and symbolic gestures. In some cases, guests would remain in the room until the newlyweds were under the covers, after which they were finally left alone. While such practices may seem invasive now, they were meant to affirm the legitimacy of the marriage and ensure that it had been properly consummated. In some communities, tokens such as a blood-stained sheet were later displayed as proof of virginity and union, though not all cultures required or condoned this level of public involvement. The first days of marriage were not always joyful. A young bride, especially one moving into her husband's home for the first time, often found herself in a strange household, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, and expected to take on new responsibilities without much guidance or support. She might be subject to the authority of her mother-in-law, expected to learn new recipes, chores, or dialects, and to immediately begin contributing to the household economy. The pressure to bear children began almost immediately, as fertility was not only desired but necessary. A barren marriage was often considered a tragedy, and in some cases, a justification for Yet many marriages did grow into stable partnerships, formed not from initial passion but from habit, cooperation, and the slow development of mutual trust. Not all weddings ended in lifelong harmony. The medieval world had mechanisms limited, but real, for the dissolution of unions that had gone badly wrong. Annulments could be granted for a number of reasons: consanguinity, non-consummation coercion, or previous marriage vows made in secret. Divorce as we know it did not exist in Catholic Europe, but separations, mensa iti thoro, from table and bed were sometimes allowed. In such cases, the couple remained technically married, but were permitted to live apart. The church investigated these matters with great care, and proceedings could take years. In noble families, the outcomes of such cases could have political ramifications, especially if inheritance was involved. Still, the vast majority of marriages remained intact, not necessarily out of happiness, but because stability was prized over emotion. Communities functioned best when households were whole, when children had two parents, and when alliances were maintained. Thus, even unhappy unions were often endured, and personal fulfillment was a secondary concern at best. Love, if it developed, was considered a blessing. But it was not the purpose of marriage, and it was certainly not guaranteed. In all of this, women occupied a complicated space, while the church insisted that they give consent. And while canon law offered them some protections, social norms and economic pressures often left them little room for refusal. A daughter could be pressured, threatened, or even physically forced into a marriage that served the interests of her family. Once married, her autonomy was limited. Her body, labor, and fertility were considered part of the household economy. And yet, within these constraints, women found ways to assert themselves through quiet influence, through managing their homes, and sometimes through prayer or strategic alliances with other women. A clever wife might shape the direction of her household, steer her children's futures, or even negotiate with her husband on matters of land, labor, or inheritance. Some widows, especially those who had inherited property or wealth, were able to wield considerable independence. A woman who had outlived her husband and whose dowry remained intact might choose not to remarry at all, enjoying a level of autonomy rare for her time. Others used widowhood as a stepping stone to new marriages, ones of their own choosing. These second unions were sometimes based more on affection or compatibility, especially when no dowry was involved and the practical pressures of youth had passed. Weddings, in the end, were not fairy tales. They were rituals of survival and continuity, vital steps in the maintenance of family, society, and faith. And yet, even within this rigid framework, people found moments of joy, a shared laugh during a feast, a husband who carved a stool for his wife, a wife who added herbs to her husband's bread because she knew it eased his aches. These quiet moments did not make the history books, but they were the soft, steady heartbeat beneath the formalities. The human side of an institution that often seemed mechanical and impersonal. As we look back on these weddings, with their contracts and customs, their careful negotiations and layered meanings, we are reminded that marriage has always been more than a ceremony. It is a reflection of its time, shaped by culture, necessity, and belief. In the medieval world, it was a fortress against chaos, a tool of order, and a path to stability. But it was also, occasionally and quietly, a place where love, real, tender, and unexpected, could bloom in the most unlikely of soils. Despite the rigid frameworks that shaped marriage and courtship in medieval Europe, the human heart was not so easily managed. Beneath the rules, customs, and rituals of dating and matrimony, there pulsed an undercurrent of longing, a quiet rebellion of desire that slipped through cracks in tradition. While most people followed the expected path from negotiation to wedding to household life, not all were willing to let love be dictated by duty. In whispers and shadows, in fields and cloisters, stories of forbidden love and secret affairs flourished. Sometimes tragic, sometimes poetic, always complex. These were not the dominant narratives of the age, but they existed at its edges, offering a glimpse into the tension between personal emotion and societal expectation. For many, especially the young and unattached, secret liaisons were not necessarily scandalous, but expected, at least to some extent. In rural communities, where everyone knew one another's names and faces, complete privacy was rare. And yet, many found ways to create moments of closeness outside the public eye. Shepherds, millers, dairymaids, and field hands, giving them the rare freedom to interact without immediate supervision. A young man driving sheep to pasture might pause near a spring where a girl washed linens. A baker's apprentice might linger outside the herb garden where a servant girl collected parsley. These fleeting encounters often carried no promises, but they sparked emotions that were otherwise kept quiet. Curiosity, excitement, yearning. In some cases, these meetings led to romance, but in many others, they remained secret, short-lived, and unspoken, carried only in memory. The Church, ever concerned with morality, sought to regulate not just marriage, but also desire. Preachers warned of lust, temptation, and carnal sin. Canon law condemned extramarital affairs and premarital intimacy, and ecclesiastical courts were tasked with investigating claims of fornication, adultery, and other sins of the flesh. Punishments ranged from public penance and fines to, in more serious cases, yet despite these deterrents, human behavior rarely followed doctrine to the letter. The gap between what was preached and what was practiced left room for secrets to thrive, and for a whole genre of folk tales, ballads, and poems to blossom around the theme of forbidden love. Among the nobility, the risks of illicit romance were even greater. and yet the temptations could be stronger still. In castles and manor houses, young men and women of similar rank often lived under the same roof for years. Pages, ladies-in-waiting, squires, and noble children, all growing up together in close quarters. They studied together, practiced etiquette together, and participated in the same feasts and entertainments. While their futures were usually determined by family interests, proximity sometimes led to feelings that defied those expectations. A young knight might fall in love with his lord's daughter. A noblewoman might feel drawn to the steward who managed her household. These relationships were fraught with risk. A union between social unequals could damage reputations, invite scandal, or be interpreted as seduction, whether mutual or not. Yet history is filled with examples of noble women and men who defied expectations for love. Some did so openly, though they often paid the price. Others disguised their intentions through poetry, song, or coded language. The tradition of courtly love, popularized in the 12th century by troubadours and poets in southern France, centered around precisely this kind of longing, idealized, unfulfilled, and often directed at someone unattainable. These poems were usually addressed by a knight to a lady far above his station, or already married. The love they described was spiritual, noble, and intentionally unconsummated. A literary device, perhaps, but one rooted in a very real, emotional experience. Through this tradition, feelings of forbidden love found expression in ways that were socially acceptable, at least in art. In monastic settings, where chastity and obedience were the central virtues, stories of secret love and longing take on an even more poignant tone. Monks and nuns were expected to renounce all earthly attachments, including romantic ones. But they were still human, still vulnerable to loneliness, attraction, and desire. In some cloisters, letters have survived between members of religious orders that reveal deep emotional bonds, and even passionate declarations. While many of these remained platonic, others may have crossed boundaries, emotionally or physically. The consequences of discovery could be severe: expulsion from the order, loss of livelihood, spiritual disgrace. And yet, some persisted in their attachments, finding solace in stolen moments, private conversations, and coded scripture verses exchanged under the guise of theological debate. Secret affairs also unfolded across social boundaries, between masters and servants, landlords and tenants, priests and parishioners. These relationships were rarely equal and often exploitative. A nobleman might pursue a maid under the pretense of generosity, or a priest might use his spiritual authority to gain access to a vulnerable woman. While not all such relationships were abusive, the power dynamics meant that consent could be murky, and accusations of misconduct were difficult to pursue. For women, especially those without family protection, the risks were immense. Pregnancy outside of marriage could lead to public shame, loss of employment, or banishment from the community. Some were forced to seek shelter in convents or hospitals for fallen women, while others disappeared from records entirely, their lives marked only by brief notations in parish registers or legal complaints. Despite this, many still pursued love in defiance of social rules. In cities, where people could more easily disappear into the crowd, secret romances were more common. Markets, taverns, and workshops provided places to meet, and lodging houses allowed couples to spend time together away from their families. Urban anonymity gave lovers a chance to act on feelings that would have been impossible to express in a small village. While city authorities still enforced moral laws, their ability to police every interaction was limited, and many affairs simply went unnoticed, or were ignored unless they led to scandal. The repercussions of forbidden love could be severe. In some cases, parents or guardians arranged forced separations, sending one party away to a distant village or placing them in service far from home. In others, couples were forced into hasty marriages to preserve reputations, not always to each other, but to more suitable partners. There were even stories of honor killings, particularly among the nobility, where family pride was valued above all else. A daughter who brought shame might be confined, disinherited, or worse. A man who seduced a noblewoman could face exile, imprisonment, or even execution, depending on the status of those involved. And yet, for all the danger, love still found a way. Couples wrote secret letters, hid messages in books, or under hearth, and used trusted servants to deliver notes and tokens. In border regions, where different languages and customs mixed, lovers used songs and dialects to disguise their meanings. A seemingly innocent lullaby might carry a hidden message. A carved pattern in a piece of bread might signal a meeting place. These quiet strategies were risky, but they spoke to a resilience of feeling, a determination to connect in a world that often discouraged genuine affection. In folk stories passed down from generation to generation, tales of forbidden love were both warnings and affirmations. The lovers almost always suffered, sometimes dramatically, banishment, death, loss of name and home. But they were also remembered. Their stories were sung at winter hearths and whispered in summer fields. They were the subjects of poems, of lullabies, of lament. These stories kept alive the idea that love could, at times, be more powerful than law, and more enduring than reputation. One famous medieval example comes from the story of Abelard, a French philosopher and his brilliant student whose passionate affair in the 12th century shocked the church and intellectual circles alike. Though their relationship was ultimately discovered and violently ended, Abelard was attacked and castrated by, say, enraged relatives. The letters they exchanged over the years revealed a deep intellectual and emotional bond that lasted long after they were separated. Their story, painful and tragic, has endured for centuries, not only because of its drama, but because it captures the fragility and beauty of love in a world determined to control it. Even among the lower classes, tales of resistance and secret love circulated. In some regions, lovers carved their initials into trees or rocks as symbols of defiance and memory. Others met in abandoned chapels, deep forests, or caves, places removed from the reach of custom and command. These locations became sacred in their own way, not because of any religious authority, but because of the emotions they held. They were places where rules could be briefly suspended, where truth could be spoken aloud, even if only for a moment. Over time, the consequences of forbidden love began to change, especially in the later Middle Ages as cities grew, literacy increased, and personal expression gained more social space. But in the heart of the medieval period, love outside the sanctioned path was still a risk few could afford, and yet many dared to take it. These stories, while not part of official chronicles or church records, tell us something essential about human nature. They remind us that even in the most structured societies, people find ways to feel, to yearn, and to connect. Not because they expect a happy ending, but because love, even dangerous love, makes life feel more alive, more real, more their own. In a world where open affection was often discouraged and courtship was governed more by arrangement than choice, many medieval people turned to subtler forms of expression to communicate the desires and emotions that could not be spoken aloud. Music, poetry, storytelling, and symbolic language became quiet refuges, places where feelings might be explored, disguised, or preserved without transgressing social boundaries. Though few medieval men or women could write in the modern sense, and fewer still had access to the education needed to craft formal verse or compose melodies, the language of love found other, softer ways to survive. Through song and symbol, through gesture and art, the inner lives of medieval lovers continued to bloom, often in secret, often in silence, but always with a quiet resilience that defied the rigid expectations of their time. The tradition of love poetry in the Middle Ages emerged most vividly in the courts of southern France, particularly through the works of the troubadours, wandering poets and musicians who composed lyrical verse, extolling idealized, often unattainable love. These compositions, sometimes sung and sometimes simply recited, rarely depicted marital affection or domestic joy. Instead, they celebrated longing, the ache of distance, the nobility of restraint, and the beauty of unfulfilled desire. A knight might express devotion to a married noblewoman, not because he hoped to win her hand, but because the love itself, held secretly and without reward, was seen as a path to moral refinement. The lover, denied physical closeness, grew spiritually through his suffering. This tradition of finamore, or refined love, shaped courtly ideals and influenced generations of poets and thinkers. Though it reflected a largely fictional or symbolic version of romance, its influence reached far beyond the aristocratic courts where it was first cultivated. Elsewhere in Europe, similar traditions flourished in local forms. The Minnesänger of Germany, the of northern France, and the cantigars of Iberia all added their own variations to the theme. Their poems, often written in vernacular languages rather than Latin, allowed emotion to be explored in ways that sermons and contracts never could. Through metaphor and allegory, they described eyes as stars, hearts as castles under siege, kisses as stolen treasures. In these poems, love was both dangerous and divine, both binding and freeing. While the language was often lofty, the feelings it conveyed were deeply human. Uncertainty, longing, jealousy, hope. For many who heard or read these works, they offered a glimpse of something tender in a world that often demanded restraint. Among the literate classes, particularly among monks, clerks, and some noblewomen, the writing of letters became another avenue for romantic expression. Though many medieval letters were dictated to scribes, love letters were often written by hand, in secret, and with careful thought. A letter might begin with formal greetings, pass through religious platitudes, and finally arrive at a line or two of heartfelt sentiment, carefully couched in ambiguous terms. A woman might write of her prayers for a man's health and safety, using biblical allusions to hint at deeper affection. A man might describe his devotion to a friend or sister in Christ, knowing that his true meaning would be understood only by the recipient. These letters were often passed through intermediaries, trusted servants, clerics, or friends, and their discovery could lead to trouble, especially if one of the parties was already married or promised elsewhere. Even among those who could not write, the language of love found form in song. Folk songs, passed orally from generation to generation, often told stories of romantic triumph and tragedy. A girl waiting by the river, a boy who sings beneath her window, a promise broken, a secret kept. These songs varied by region, but many shared a common emotional rhythm, a wistful longing for connection, a quiet sadness at its loss. Some were bawdy and playful, others tender and mournful. They were sung at harvest festivals, during spinning nights, or by firesides in winter. Though simple in melody and verse, they carried the emotional weight of shared experience. A farmer's daughter in England might sing a song her grandmother had taught her, one that echoed the feelings of thousands of other women across the countryside. Feelings that could not be spoken aloud, but could be carried, gently, in melody. The visual arts, too, became a canvas for romantic expression. In illuminated manuscripts, lovers might be depicted exchanging glances beneath a tree, their hands almost touching. In stained glass windows, biblical stories of devotion and sacrifice were rendered in rich color, offering both spiritual and emotional resonance. Marginalia, the whimsical drawings in the margins of medieval books, sometimes featured animals courting one another, or playful scenes of romance that hinted at the inner lives of those who copied or commissioned the works. Tapestries, which adorned the walls of wealthier homes, often told love stories in visual form. Persephone and Hades, Tristan and Isolde, though officially commissioned for decorative or allegorical purposes, these images allowed love to be displayed, albeit in symbolic form, in spaces where its open discussion was discouraged. The language of flowers also held meaning in the medieval imagination. Though the full development of floral symbolism would not come until later centuries, certain associations were already well known. A red rose signified passion, a lily purity. A sprig of thyme might be given for courage, while violets spoke of modesty. These meanings were woven into songs, poems, and even gestures. A girl might wear a daisy in her hair during spring festivals, signaling both her innocence and her readiness to be noticed. A boy might place a small bouquet on a windowsill, knowing that its arrangement would be understood as a message. In some communities, young people exchanged flowers during May Day rituals, and entire garlands were constructed with careful intent. Each bloom was a word, each combination a sentence, read and interpreted by those who knew the code. Gestures, too, served as their own kind of language. A glance held slightly too long, a hand brushing another's during the passing of bread act, a act of standing closer than custom dictated. All of these could speak volume. In a society where space, touch, and expression were tightly regulated by rank and gender, even the smallest movement could carry meaning. Lovers learned to read one another through subtlety, through the way a smile curved, the way a phrase was repeated, the timing of a visit to the well or market. These moments were small, but they formed the vocabulary of affection, a quiet grammar of connection spoken by those who could not risk being overheard. The language of love was not always used for noble purposes. Just as poems could woo, they could also deceive. Just as glances could comfort, they could manipulate. A man might use romantic words to gain trust, only to abandon a girl once her reputation was compromised. A woman might feign affection to secure a marriage or inheritance. The tools of romantic expression, like any language, could be used for both sincerity and deceit. This dual nature added complexity to the courtship process, and made the guidance of family and community all the more important. Reputation was built not only on actions but on words, and a single line in a song or a careless phrase in a letter could shape a person's future. Still, for many, the risks were worth it. To express love, to say, in some way, "I see you and I choose you," was a powerful act in an era when most choices were made by others. The language of love, in whatever form it took, allowed people to reclaim a small piece of their own lives. It allowed them to feel, to dream, to imagine a world in which love might guide the future rather than duty. And even when that dream could not be realized, the act of expressing it offered comfort. A song sung in the quiet of a stable, a poem whispered into the wind, a flower left behind in a chapel pew. These were the gestures that made life softer, even if only for a moment. In time, these expressions became part of the larger cultural memory. They influenced literature, inspired paintings, and shaped the way later generations understood medieval romance. They served as reminders that even in a world of structure and silence, the human need to love and be loved endured. And while the words themselves may have faded, the feelings they conveyed, longing, devotion, courage, tenderness, remain as familiar today as they were 1,000 years ago. Thus, the language of love in the medieval world was not defined by grammar or literacy, but by creativity, courage, and subtlety. It lived in the margins of books, in the verses of songs, in the twist of a ribbon or the hush of a glance. And in that quiet, intricate language, people found a way to speak their hearts. Not always boldly, not always safely, but always with hope. In a time when love was often hidden, negotiated, or forbidden, the act of expressing it became its own kind of triumph, a whispered victory carried on the wind. In medieval Europe, a young person's path to marriage was rarely theirs to choose freely. While stories of romance and tender affection did exist, the foundation of most unions, especially those of lasting consequence, was shaped less by hearts and more by hands. The hands of parents, relatives, guardians, and elders. The hands that held property deeds, measured dowries, arranged inheritance, and watched over reputations. Love, if it came, was often a fortunate byproduct rather than a starting point. Marriage in this world was a tool, one wielded carefully to strengthen a family's position, ensure social survival, and preserve or improve standing in the eyes of both church and community. At the center of that tool was parental authority, firm and inescapable. The role of parents in arranging marriages was nearly universal. Whether in the halls of a noble estate or the thatched cottages of a rural hamlet, a son or daughter's future spouse was rarely chosen without family involvement. Among the landed classes, this involvement was formal, sometimes drawn out over years of negotiation. A father might begin discussions with a neighboring family as soon as his children reached adolescence, even earlier if significant property or political advantage was at stake. These conversations were rarely casual. They involved careful calculations about lineage, alliances, dowry size, and legal implications. A daughter's hand was a valuable commodity, one that could shift the fate of multiple estates if leveraged properly. And because so much depended on the decisions of the elder generation, the voice of the young woman herself, the one expected to share her life, her home, and her body, was often a whisper in the background. Among peasants and artisans, the negotiations were simpler in scale but not in importance. A man might seek a wife who could bring labor to his household, someone strong enough to tend livestock, prepare food, raise children, and survive the seasonal rhythms of village life. A girl's parents, in turn, would look for a man with a steady hand and a patch of land, however modest. If he could offer a shared roof and promise of bread through winter, he might be deemed acceptable. But even then, the match had to pass muster with the elders. A father might test a suitor with physical tasks, judge his demeanor over several visits, or gather information quietly from neighbors. A mother might observe how the boy treated his own kin, whether he spoke kindly or harshly, whether his family name carried honor or whispered scandal. The process was not legalistic, but it was methodical, and often final. In these families, obedience was not just expected but enforced. A daughter who resisted a proposed match might be scolded, isolated, or worse. Though the church eventually insisted that marriage must be entered into with the free consent of both parties. In practice, this principle was often a fragile one, especially in remote areas where ecclesiastical oversight was minimal. Even among those who respected church law, The definition of free consent could be interpreted loosely. A girl who nodded after being pressured was said to have agreed. A boy who said nothing might later be told he had accepted. The silence of youth was taken as compliance, especially when that silence made life easier for everyone else. This parental control was not always unkind. Many mothers and fathers genuinely believed they were acting in their children's best interests. In a world filled with uncertainty, where war, disease, and famine loomed, securing a stable, respectable marriage for a child could be seen as an act of love, not control. To marry well was to survive, and to survive was, in many ways, the highest goal of any medieval household. Parents remembered their own struggles. They feared what might happen to a daughter who married a drunkard, a gambler, or a man too poor to feed her. They knew how quickly a woman's reputation could be lost, and how hard it was to restore. In their minds, careful oversight of marriage was a form of protection, perhaps stern, perhaps unforgiving, but born of experience and concern. Still, tensions often brewed beneath the surface. A son might long to marry a girl whose family owned nothing but a cow and a crumbling hut, because she smiled when she spoke and listened when he talked about his dreams. A daughter might love a boy with calloused hands and eyes full of kindness, even though his father had once been fined for stealing grain. In such cases, families might intervene swiftly. A girl could be sent away, to live with an aunt in another village, to work in a manor far from home, or to join a convent where no glances were exchanged and no names were whispered. A boy might be threatened with disinheritance or forcibly apprenticed in a distant town, removing him from temptation and placing him firmly back on the expected path. Such separations were rarely framed as punishments. They were said to be necessary, for the good of the family, for the reputation of the girl, for the future of the household name. Inheritance further complicated the matter. In most parts of Europe, land was the key to wealth, and land passed through families in narrow, carefully maintained channels. A marriage could disrupt or solidify this flow. A daughter might be promised to a cousin to keep property within the bloodline. A son might be encouraged to marry a girl whose family owned the adjacent field, thereby enlarging the estate without bloodshed or boundary disputes. Inheritance laws varied widely. Some allowed all sons to inherit equally. Others followed primogeniture, passing everything to the eldest. Daughters, unless provided for by dowry, often received little. This reality made marriage even more critical. A poorly matched marriage could sever a family's claims, divide its land, or dilute its influence. As such, marriages were mapped as carefully as military campaigns. The stakes were not only emotional but existential. Families pored over wills, contracts, and lineage charts. They consulted priests, notaries, and elders. They remembered old promises, old feuds, and the whispered debts of generations past. In noble families, entire genealogies were studied before a proposal was made, ensuring no forbidden kinship would jeopardize the union. Among commoners, the memory of grandparents and great-uncles was often enough. The oral history of the village acted as its own archive, and anyone who tried to cross a boundary would soon be reminded of their place. Even once married, a couple's life remained closely linked to their families. A husband might be expected to defer to his father's decisions on matters of land or livestock. A wife might be under the authority of her mother-in-law for years, learning the rhythms of cooking, cleaning, and childbirth under her watchful eye. The new household, while nominally independent, was often deeply entangled with the old one. Gifts and favors passed between generations, a piglet here, a set of tools there, but so too did expectations, judgments, and obligations. A young couple's happiness was not theirs alone to shape. It was balanced on a lattice of tradition, scrutiny, and shared interest. Still, not all was cold or calculated. Some parents listened. Some matches, though arranged, became partnerships of genuine affection. There are quiet stories, rarely recorded but long remembered, of fathers who allowed their daughters to marry kind men with no fortune, of mothers who saw the light in a girl's eyes and chose to protect it. There were compromises, small victories, and slow shifts in custom. As towns grew and trade expanded, especially in the later medieval period, the rigidity of parental control softened in some regions. Young people with marketable skills or independent incomes gained more bargaining power. And as literacy spread, particularly among the middle classes, ideas about romance, consent, and personal choice began to circulate in letters, poems, and popular stories. Yet even then, tradition lingered. It clung to the edges of every decision, whispered into the ear of every matchmaker and parent. The notion that elders knew best, that youth could not be trusted to shape its own future, remained a defining feature of medieval family life. And while this belief may seem stifling now, it was rooted in a worldview where survival was uncertain, and where the wisdom of age was often the only protection against hunger, shame, or ruin. In the end, the role of parents in medieval courtship was both a reflection of their world and a response to it. They sought to guard what they had built, to protect what they had earned, and to guide their children safely through a landscape filled with danger. Their influence could be a burden, but it could also be a shield. And within that balance, the dance of love and duty played out, sometimes painfully, sometimes peacefully, and sometimes, just sometimes, with a quiet harmony that no contract or coin could measure. In the medieval world, love did not blossom in a vacuum. It unfolded amid plagues, invasions, famines, and spiritual quests. The rhythm of life was often interrupted by marching armies, spreading illness, or long journeys to distant shrines. And yet, even in these uncertain seasons, people still found each other. The search for companionship did not pause because the world was unstable. If anything, the uncertainty of daily life made love feel more urgent, more necessary, and at times, more daring. Whether it was a hurried courtship before a soldier's departure, a whispered vow in the shadow of illness, or a bond formed along the dusty roads of pilgrimage, romance continued to pulse quietly beneath the chaos of medieval life. Wartime courtship carried its own complications. Across Europe, feudal lords summoned their vassals regularly for battle. Whether to defend land, reclaim disputed territory, or serve in larger campaigns under royal banners, men were often gone for weeks or months at a time, and sometimes never returned. In noble households, this meant the women were left behind to manage estates, instruct servants, oversee harvests, and maintain order. Among peasants, it meant that wives, mothers, and daughters had to step into the roles of their absent men. Fields still needed plowing, livestock still needed feeding, and bread still had to be baked. Whether or not the men were home to help, the constant churn of conflict shaped how people approached relationships. A young man preparing to go off to war might rush to declare his intentions, asking permission to marry sooner than planned. A girl might accept a match quickly, knowing that delaying could mean never seeing her suitor again. These unions were not always romantic. Sometimes they were forged out of fear. Fear of being left unmarried, of being alone in uncertain times, or of having no claim to a man's protection or property should he not return. But within those rushed decisions, there were also flashes of sincerity. A soldier might carry a token of his bride into battle, a small piece of cloth, a carved charm, a lock of hair. These items became talismans, reminders of something soft and steady waiting at home. Among the upper classes, marriage could serve as a political tool in wartime. A noblewoman might be wed to the son of a former enemy to seal a peace treaty. The marriage would be celebrated with grand ceremony, but behind the feasting and formality was often a quiet calculation, an attempt to turn conflict into alliance. The young couple might not even speak the same language. In some cases, they did not meet until the wedding day. And yet, these political matches shaped the course of history, drawing lines across maps and giving birth to heirs who carried the future of kingdoms. In times of plague, love took on an entirely different shape. The arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century devastated Europe, killing millions in a matter of years and reshaping nearly every aspect of society. Entire villages were emptied, fields were left untended, streets fell silent. The church struggled to explain the horror, and people turned to prayer, fear, and superstition in equal measure. In this atmosphere of grief and uncertainty, romantic relationships took on new urgency. Some people married quickly, believing that the world might end and wanting to leave behind some trace of companionship. Others delayed marriage indefinitely, too afraid to gather, celebrate, or risk the economic burden of a household. There are records of couples marrying during the plague, simply because they believed it was their last chance to be together. In some towns, emergency marriage rituals were developed. Shorter, simpler ceremonies performed by lay people or traveling clergy. These weddings were often held in haste, with minimal witness and no festivity. A young woman might marry a dying man out of compassion, hoping to comfort him in his final days. A widow might remarry quickly for protection or support. The plague turned many social expectations upside down, including those around courtship. Love in this era was no longer just a matter of alliance or inheritance. It became, sometimes, a matter of survival, emotional, financial, and spiritual. Not all plague-time romances were marked by tragedy. In some cases, the great reshuffling of households led to unexpected connections. Orphans were taken in by distant relatives or neighbors. Widows moved to new towns to escape the memory of loss. Servants and workers, in short supply due to the death toll, found new employment in unfamiliar places. These movements brought people into contact who might never have met otherwise. A carpenter from one region might fall in love with a brewer's daughter in another. A former nun, released from a shuttered convent, might find comfort in the company of a widowed farmer. These chance meetings, born from the ashes of disaster, sometimes blossomed into lasting unions. Quiet, hopeful testaments to resilience. Pilgrimage, too, played an unexpected role in medieval romance. While religious devotion was the primary purpose of these journeys, the long roads and shared inns created a space where people of all ages and statuses mingled. Men and women traveled in groups for safety, sleeping in close quarters and sharing meals. Along the way, friendships formed, conversations deepened, bonds were created that sometimes went beyond the spiritual. A night walking the Camino de Santiago might meet a merchant's daughter seeking penance. A widow making her way to Canterbury might find companionship with a scholar from Paris. Though romance was not the purpose of these pilgrimages, the distance from home and the loosening of normal social rules allowed space for connection. Many pilgrims wore badges that marked their destinations, tiny metal symbols shaped like scallop shells, swords, or saints, and exchanging these tokens could become a gesture of affection. Some of these relationships lasted only for the duration of the journey, dissolved as each person returned to their home and station, but others continued, leading to letters, visits, and, in some rare cases, marriage. These stories often faded from official record, but they were passed down in oral traditions and written into tales told by firelight. Pilgrimage gave people a temporary freedom to walk, to think, to speak, and sometimes to love. Even during periods of famine and hardship, love found its place. In lean times, families were less eager to marry off daughters, knowing that dowries would be harder to gather and mouths more difficult to feed. And yet, affection still bloomed. A pair of young shepherds might share what little food they had. A woman might care for a sick neighbor's child, forming bonds of tenderness that deepened over time. Marriage, during these difficult seasons, was not always practical, but companionship remained essential. A balm against hunger, fear, and loss. People turned to each other for warmth, comfort, and the simple kindness of a familiar face. In border regions, where cultures mixed and languages blended, love could become an act of quiet rebellion. A girl from a Saxon village might fall in love with a boy from a Norman outpost. Their families, once on opposite sides of a war or land dispute, might disapprove. And yet, these cross-cultural romances occurred more often than records suggest. The mingling of dialects, clothing styles, and customs created space for curiosity. A borrowed phrase, a shared dish, a dance learned from another village. These were the beginnings of attraction. Though not all such unions were accepted, and many were kept secret, they added richness to the cultural landscape. The children of these marriages often spoke multiple languages and carried within them the legacy of two once separated peoples. Throughout all these upheavals, war, plague, pilgrimage, famine, and cultural blending, one truth endured: the human desire to connect did not vanish. It adapted, it softened its voice, disguised itself in ritual or song, and waited patiently for quiet moments. People did not stop looking for one another simply because the world was hard. In fact, the very hardness of life often made love more vivid. A letter carried through dangerous territory. A flower placed on a windowsill before a man marched off to battle. A song hummed beneath a veil at a funeral. These were the gestures of people who had little control over their world, but still chose to express care. Even the clergy, who preached chastity and self-denial, could not deny the strength of human bonds. Priests, monks, and nuns recorded stories of couples who remained faithful across great distances, who prayed for one another during times of illness or war, who gave alms in one another's names. These stories were shared not as scandal but as examples of virtue. Love that survived not through rebellion, but through patience and sacrifice. In these accounts, love became a mirror of divine constancy, something to admire and emulate. As the medieval period stretched on, its harshness never truly faded. Disease would return, battles would resume, and hunger would remain a constant threat for many. But through it all, the patterns of courtship, connection, and care wove their way into the daily fabric of life. No matter how much was lost, people continued to reach for one another, and in doing so, they shaped a quieter history, one not found in chronicles of kings or records of conquest, but in lullabies sung to children, in letters tucked beneath hearthstones, and in the spaces between farewell and return. In the tapestry of medieval courtship, one cannot fully understand the path to marriage without examining the weighty expectations placed upon men and women, and how differently those expectations were enforced. Gender shaped not only the roles each person played in love and marriage, but also the consequences of desire, the possibilities for agency, and the quiet burdens carried on either side of the divide. It is tempting, perhaps, to imagine courtship in the Middle Ages as merely quaint, a world of chivalric gestures and arranged but beneath the surface was a far more complicated truth. One defined by imbalance, social risk, and the sharp edge of tradition. The standards for love, behavior, and virtue were not shared equally. Men were granted freedoms that women were denied. Women were tasked with moral responsibility that often exceeded their power. And while both genders were caught in webs of custom, the threads that bound women were woven more tightly and with less mercy. From the earliest ages, boys and girls in the medieval world were raised with different expectations. A boy's value was often measured in strength, labor, or lineage, his future shaped by what he could offer to his household, to his overlord, or to the church. A girl's value, by contrast, was frequently tied to her reputation, her dowry, and her capacity for obedience. From childhood, girls were taught to guard their modesty, not only in behavior, but in dress, voice, and manner. A girl who laughed too loudly, who made eye contact too boldly, or who was seen too often in the company of boys could quickly become a subject of gossip. And gossip, in medieval villages, spread as swiftly as wind through a barley field. While boys might be chastised for roughness or laziness, girls were judged with a sharper lens. A misstep in appearance or posture could be seen as a reflection on the entire family. A father's reputation, a mother's standing in the church, even a brother's marital prospects could be affected by a girl perceived as forward or improper. These judgments were not simply social, they had practical consequences. A girl with a stained reputation, whether the stain was earned or not, could struggle to find a match. Her dowry might be increased as compensation. Her options might narrow to widowers, older men, or those of lower standing. In extreme cases, she might be pushed into a convent, not out of religious calling, but out of familial necessity. And yet, for all this scrutiny, young women were still expected to attract suitors. The paradox was sharp. A girl had to be noticed, but not too much. She had to appear appealing, but never too eager. Her voice should be soft, but not silent. Her presence should be graceful, but not commanding. To navigate this balance was an act of constant self-control, a delicate performance of restraint within the confines of a world where power rarely belonged to her. Men, meanwhile, were often praised for boldness in courtship. A young man who pursued a girl persistently, with gifts, songs, or declarations, was seen as admirable, even romantic. If he was rebuffed, he might be told to try harder, or simply to wait until the girl came to her senses. This kind of behavior, while not universally accepted, was far more tolerated in men than in women. A girl who pursued a boy with similar fervor, however, risked being labeled as shameless. Her reputation could sour quickly, especially if she was perceived as overly flirtatious or indiscreet. The imbalance extended beyond social norms to the legal and religious realms. Canon law, which governed much of medieval Europe, technically required mutual consent for a marriage to be valid. But in practice, this requirement was more theoretical than protective. A man who claimed a girl had consented could often avoid punishment for impropriety, especially if witnesses were scarce or the girl's family lacked influence. A girl who claimed coercion or deception, by contrast, had to prove her case, a near impossible task without corroboration. In many cases, the girl's own silence was used as evidence against her. She did not cry out. She did not run away. She must have consented. This reality made women especially vulnerable during courtship. The line between flirtation and danger was thin, and the consequences of misjudging it could be lifelong, even when a girl entered a relationship willingly. If the match ended poorly or failed to result in marriage, she often bore the brunt of the blame. A boy might be scolded, told to find another bride, or suffer minor penalties. A girl, however, could be left with damaged prospects, strained family relations, or even a child born out of wedlock, a burden that often led to permanent social exclusion. Despite these risks, women were not passive. They developed strategies for self-protection, subtle expressions of agency, and networks of support among female kin. A mother might quietly guide her daughter through the signs of genuine affection versus manipulation. A grandmother might pass down advice hidden in folk tales or proverbs. In some cases, groups of women acted together to protect a girl's reputation, offering alibis, intercepting letters, or steering unsuitable men away through gossip or direct confrontation. While these efforts were informal and often invisible to official records, they played a critical role in helping women navigate a society that placed them at a constant disadvantage. In literature and song, women were sometimes idealized, depicted as pure, noble, or divinely inspired. The Virgin Mary, chivalric ladies, and saintly heroines became cultural symbols of feminine virtue. But these ideals were often unattainable and unforgiving. A real woman could not always be both silent and wise, obedient and strong, beautiful and invisible. The gap between the ideal and the real left many women caught in a space of quiet contradiction, expected to embody perfection while rarely granted the power to shape their own stories. Men, for their part, were not always unbound by pressure. While they enjoyed more freedom in courtship, they were also expected to perform masculinity in rigid ways. A man who failed to pursue a bride, provide for a household, or assert his authority could face ridicule. A gentle or hesitant suitor might be mocked as weak, and while their sexual transgressions were more easily forgiven, they were still subject to moral teachings, religious judgment, and in some cases, legal penalty. The church preached that lustful behavior was sinful, even for men, and confession often included questions about romantic conduct. Yet in practice, society granted them far more leeway, a privilege often reinforced through storytelling, law, and custom. The double standard became most evident in the aftermath of scandal. A girl accused of premarital relations, regardless of truth, might be forced to undergo public penance, wear a particular color to mass, or kneeled before the parish with a candle in hand. Boys, if they were punished at all, might receive only a brief reprimand or symbolic fine. This disparity was not only about morality, but economics. A girl's reputation was tied to her marital value, and thus to her family's financial future. A boy's misbehavior, while regrettable, was rarely seen as a financial liability in the same way. The expectations of gender shaped not just behavior, but the language of love itself. In letters, men were encouraged to be expressive, persuasive, and bold. Women, if they wrote at all, were expected to be cautious, deferential, and modest. Even within courtly love poetry, a genre that often praised the wisdom and beauty of women, the voice of the female beloved was largely silent. She was the object of desire, not the speaker of it. Her worth lay in her distance, her unavailability, her capacity to inspire suffering in men. In this way, even romantic idealization reinforced the social silence of women. And yet, within this silence, women still found ways to speak. They used embroidery to share private messages, weaving symbols into cloth that only trusted eyes could read. They sang lullabies that carried layered meanings. They carved initials into bread loaves, placed flowers in particular arrangements, or selected herbs with careful intention. These acts were not always recorded, but they formed a language of their own, one born out of necessity, creativity, and quiet resistance. Over time, some of these gendered expectations began to shift, especially in urban centers where economic independence offered new possibilities. Women who worked as merchants, brewers, or midwives gained leverage in choosing partners. Widowhood, too, offered a strange kind of freedom, allowing a woman to remarry or remain single on her own terms. But these changes were slow, partial, and uneven. For most women across medieval Europe, courtship remained a narrow corridor, flanked on all sides by the twin walls of modesty and obedience. The story of gender and courtship in the Middle Ages is not a tale of villains and victims, but of imbalance. It is a story of uneven expectations, enforced with care and cruelty alike. It is a record of how love, that most personal of emotions, was shaped by social forces far larger than the individuals who felt it. And, in its quiet corners, in the margins of manuscripts, the stanzas of folk songs, the patterns of weaving, and the pauses in speech, it is a story that still echoes, because even within constraint, people found ways to express affection. Even within imbalance, they found ways to care, and even within silence, they found ways to speak. For all the emphasis placed on finding a match, negotiating a dowry, and upholding reputations through the act of marriage, the story of love in medieval times did not end at the wedding. In fact, for most people, it was only after the vows had been spoken and the guests had departed that the true nature of the relationship began to unfold. Far from the poetic promises of courtly songs or the strategic calculations of parental arrangements, life after marriage was steady, ordinary, and often quietly revealing. It was here, in the rhythms of daily labor, shared meals, and winter fires, that affection either deepened or faded. For couples across medieval Europe, noble and peasant alike, marriage was not the culmination of love, but its quiet testing ground. Unlike the idealized romances found in troubadour verse, the majority of medieval marriages were formed with little regard for emotional compatibility. Partners often entered marriage as near strangers, joined not by affection but by duty, family pressure, or survival needs. And yet, many of these relationships grew into genuine bonds. Love, when it came slowly. Not as a spark, but as a steady ember nurtured by time, familiarity, and mutual effort. A woman who tended her husband's wounds in silence. These gestures, small, repeated, and sometimes unnoticed, built the emotional foundation of many medieval unions. The home, whether a manor or a one-room cottage, became the space where these bonds played out. Roles were clearly divided by gender, but both partners were essential to the functioning of the household. A wife managed the hearth, preserved food, spun wool, raised children, and often worked alongside her husband in the fields or at the market. A husband, in turn, provided protection, performed heavy labor, oversaw major decisions, and represented the family in legal or public matters. Their lives were physically interwoven. From the moment the rooster crowed to the sound of the evening bell, they shared the same work, the same space, and the same fate. This proximity bred familiarity, and familiarity sometimes bred fondness. A couple who had once exchanged little more than formal words at the altar might, over the years, learn to anticipate each other's moods, to find comfort in shared silence, or to laugh together after a hard day's labor. Their affection, if it emerged, was rarely spoken aloud. It was folded into gestures. The husband who brought home a rare honeycomb from the woods, the wife who patched her husband's only tunic with care. Love was not the kind written in letters or carved into tree trunks. It was the kind woven into routines. The ladling of soup, the sweeping of the floor, the soft murmur before sleep. Among the nobility, the shape of married life was more complex. Noble couples often spent long periods apart, the husband serving in battle, the wife managing the estate. Their relationship might be formal, political, or merely functional. And yet, some noble marriages also grew into affectionate partnerships. Letters between noble couples, though often dictated or written by clerks, occasionally reveal hints of warmth, a reference to a favorite shared memory, a concern for health, a request for a keepsake to be sent. These glimpses suggest that, even within highly strategic unions, there was space for feeling. Sometimes it was muted, veiled by politeness, but it was present. In many households, children followed quickly after marriage. The birth of a child was both a joy and a responsibility. It changed the dynamic of the marriage, redirecting attention and deepening the bond between parents. For many couples, the shared task of raising children created a new kind of connection, rooted not in romance, but in purpose. They worked side by side to feed, clothe, and educate their children, often sacrificing personal comfort for the sake of the next generation. Watching a husband cradle an infant or a wife sing to a child by the hearth could create moments of tenderness between spouses, even when their marriage had not begun with love. Still, the pressures of survival left little room for sentiment. Illness was constant, mortality rates were high, crops failed, taxes rose, and yet, through it all, couples endured. Their relationships were not measured by grand gestures, but by resilience. A wife who stayed up tending to a sick child, while her husband chopped firewood outside. A husband who took on extra labor so his wife could rest during pregnancy. These quiet acts of devotion formed the real heart of medieval married life. They were not praised in song or scripture, but they were the moments in which love, not the fleeting kind, but the enduring kind, quietly took root. Marriages that did not find affection often still found stability. Couples might coexist peacefully, bonded more by necessity than emotion. In these unions, care might be expressed as practicality, making sure the other had dry shoes, setting aside the best piece of meat, standing beside each other during feast days and funerals. The love might be faint or absent, but there was often a deep sense of responsibility. To the household, the children, the community. Divorce was not an option. Separation was rare and scandalous. So they stayed, and in staying, they forged lives together that, while not passionate, were solid and lasting. Of course, not all marriages were peaceful. Some were marked by resentment, cruelty, or neglect. Women, especially, were vulnerable within the marital structure. The husband had legal authority over his wife and, in many regions, could discipline her without interference. Abuse was rarely prosecuted unless it caused visible harm or scandal. A woman suffering in her marriage had few options. She might confide in a priest, seek protection from her family, or turn to religious orders for refuge. But, in most cases, she endured in silence. There were also husbands who suffered from coldness, betrayal, or public shame, though their situations were treated with more sympathy and often more options for redress. Despite these hardships, there were moments when marriage was more than duty, when it became a shared life of subtle joys, an older couple walking slowly to church together, hand in hand, a man smiling at his wife as she laughed with their grandchildren. These were the scenes that did not make it into court records or illuminated manuscripts, but they were real. They were the reward, perhaps 4 years of patient labor, for choosing to remain kind, for learning to love the person who had once been chosen for you. Over time, some marriages deepened into companionship, with the children grown and the burdens of youth behind them. Couples found time to speak more gently, to reflect on the years past, to rely on each other in new ways. The husband might carve a walking stick for his aging wife. A wife might continue preparing her husband's favorite meal, even when his appetite waned. These were the quiet chapters of love, written not with passion, but with presence. Community life often reflected these bonds. Villagers might speak kindly of a couple who had weathered decades together. Children would grow up seeing their parents' example, not always one of overt romance, but of steady cooperation. These models influenced the next generation's expectations, reinforcing the idea that love, if it came, was a slow, earned thing, not a thunderbolt but a slow-growing vine, twining itself around 2 lives built side by side. Among the elderly, love sometimes reappeared in second marriages. A widow and widower, both familiar with the work of partnership, might choose to marry again, not out of economic necessity. These unions, often free from the pressures of fertility or family alliances, were sometimes among the most peaceful. 2 people sharing the last years of life, tending a garden, mending clothes, telling stories. In a time when many died young, such unions were quiet blessings. Religious life also offered alternative models of affection. In convents and monasteries, bonds formed that were not romantic but deeply loving. A nun might care for a sick sister with unwavering devotion. A monk might write letters of encouragement to a fellow brother. These relationships, though outside the bounds of marriage, revealed the capacity of the human heart to form lasting, meaningful connections. Even in celibacy, even in silence, the boundaries of love were wider than doctrine allowed, and within those boundaries, people found comfort. Ultimately, medieval marriage was a reflection of the world itself, structured, demanding, but not without grace. Love was not promised, but for those who found it, however quietly, however slowly, it was enough. Enough to endure long winters, enough to share meager harvests, enough to walk together, year after year, beneath the turning sky. And so, the story of medieval love does not end with the wedding. It continues. In firewood chopped, in bread shared, in children raised, in silence respected. It continues in the ways people chose to stay, to care, to try. In that quiet persistence, in that slow and steady kindness, love, true love, left its most enduring mark. Though the term medieval Europe often evokes a singular image, stone castles, Latin-speaking priests, and chainmail-clad knights, the truth was far more diverse. Europe in the Middle Ages was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, tribes, and city-states, each with their own customs, languages, and rhythms of daily life. Nowhere was this diversity more apparent than in the courtship rituals of different regions. While the church provided a common spiritual framework for marriage, local traditions continued to shape how young people met. expressed affection, and entered into partnership. What counted as proper in one region might be scandalous in another. A courtship custom cherished in a small alpine village might be unthinkable in the halls of a Mediterranean noble estate. And through this regional variety, we glimpse a broader, richer picture of how love, or something like it, was sought and shaped in the medieval world. In the Highlands of Scotland, for example, courtship often followed community-based rituals that emphasized physical labor and familial reputation. Young men seeking wives were expected to prove their usefulness, not with flowery language or musical talent, but through action. A suitor might assist a girl's family in the harvest or help repair fences around their grazing lands. His willingness to work hard and quietly was seen as a more reliable measure of character than anything he could say. Among highland communities, where cattle herding and seasonal movement were common, courtship took place in fleeting windows, often during fairs, religious festivals, or seasonal gatherings, when distant neighbors came together. Dances and shared meals provided rare chances for mingling, and many matches began with a glance, over a shared fire, or the quiet offer of oatcake. Moving further south to the British Isles lowland regions, especially in parts of England and Wales, customs such as bundling appeared. Though it varied in form, bundling typically involved a suitor spending the night in the same bed as his potential bride, with full clothing, and sometimes with a board or barrier placed between them. While this might seem scandalous to modern readers, bundling was a courtship ritual designed to allow the couple time to talk, to observe one another's character, and to begin the slow process of becoming familiar before the expectations of marriage were imposed. In some villages, it was done with the blessing and supervision of the parents. While not without its moral critics, bundling persisted for centuries, particularly in rural and Protestant communities, where local tradition held strong influence over daily life. On the continent, in regions such as the Low Countries and the Rhineland, courtship often took on a more structured tone, influenced by both guild culture and town regulations. Young men belonging to guilds, whether as apprentices, journeymen, or masters, were expected to demonstrate financial readiness and craft mastery before seeking a wife. This meant that courtship was delayed for many, sometimes until their late 20s or 30s. Once ready, however, the suitor might participate in carefully choreographed courtship events, including family dinners, church processions, or civic dances. In many towns, it was customary for the suitor to offer symbolic gifts, a lace-edged cloth, a small silver coin, or a pair of gloves, each carrying different meanings, depending on their color and presentation. For instance, gloves lined with fur might signify prosperity and warmth, while plain linen gloves, further east, in the Slavic territories of Poland, Bohemia, and Russia, courtship was deeply intertwined with seasonal cycles and communal rituals. Spring and summer festivals, particularly those surrounding planting and harvest, offered opportunities for matchmaking. Songs, games, and folk dances provided space for interaction, often organized and overseen by elders or designated matchmakers. In some regions, girls wore flower crowns woven with particular herbs and leaves, each symbolizing an element of their personality or readiness for marriage. Boys, in turn, might attempt to steal or earn these crowns through dance, song, or feats of strength. The act of placing the crown back on the girl's head was a gesture rich in meaning, a public sign of interest and a step toward formal courtship. Matchmakers were still common in these regions, especially in tight-knit rural communities, and while many couples had some voice in the decision, the influence of family and tradition remained strong. In the Iberian Peninsula, particularly in Castile, Aragon, and parts of Portugal, courtship was shaped by the legacies of Roman law, Visigothic custom, and the influence of both Christian and Muslim cultural traditions. Among Christians, betrothal was often treated as a semi-legal contract, and local councils sometimes became involved in disputes over promised marriages, dowry failures, or broken engagements. The act of serenading a potential bride beneath her window, a practice romanticized in later centuries, had its roots in Iberian village customs, though it was not always welcomed by families seeking quiet, orderly alliances. In towns influenced by Andalusi culture, where Muslim and Christian populations had mingled for generations, ideas about love and poetry had an even more refined edge. Among educated classes, poetry was exchanged, sometimes in secret, between suitors and their intended, with verses written in Arabic, Hebrew, or Latin. The blending of cultural traditions in this region created a uniquely rich courtship vocabulary, where affection might be declared in song, sealed in writing, and confirmed with elaborate rituals involving gifts of fruit, spices, or textiles. In Italy, especially in the city-states of Florence, Venice, and Siena, the rise of merchant wealth and urban governance gave shape to a courtship system marked by negotiation, spectacle, and formality. Wealthy families often employed censali, matchmakers who acted as brokers, evaluating family lineage, dowries, and political alliances. A match might be discussed for months or years before any contact between the prospective bride and groom took place. However, once a marriage was arranged, elaborate public rituals followed: gift-giving, dowry parades, religious blessings, and carefully orchestrated family feasts. These events served both to celebrate the union and to display the wealth and honor of the families involved. Among the lower classes, courtship remained simpler, still shaped by guild rules and community expectations, but with more room for affection and spontaneity. In Scandinavia, particularly in Norway and Sweden, courtship traditions were tied closely to farm life, oral storytelling, and seasonal migration patterns. Long winters and remote homesteads meant that social gatherings were rare and precious. Courtship dances, held in barns or village halls, were major events where young people from scattered farms came together. A boy might show his interest by offering hand-carved gifts, wooden spoons, brooches, or tools. Girls, in turn, might present embroidered tokens, such as cuffs or caps. Storytelling played an important role in the courtship process, and it was not uncommon for suitors to entertain the household with folk tales or riddles, a means of demonstrating wit, charm, and good humor. Among the Sami people of the far north, courtship often involves symbolic acts connected to nature, following reindeer tracks together, exchanging furs, or offering gifts made from bone and antler. Across the Mediterranean, particularly in the Balkans and parts of Greece, courtship rituals blended ancient pagan symbols with Christian sacraments. In many regions, engagement involved the ritual sharing of bread, wine, and oil, symbols of fertility, abundance, and divine blessing. A family gathering would mark the beginning of the courtship, with elders offering blessings and asking formal questions of intent. Songs played an essential role, lamenting, teasing, blessing, with particular melodies reserved for different stages of the courtship process. The bride's dowry was often displayed publicly, stitched into visible cloths, or laid out for community members to admire. This transparency, though practical, also made the process deeply communal, turning a private choice into a shared celebration. Even within isolated mountain communities, such as the Basques or the Alpine valleys of Switzerland, unique traditions emerged. In these areas, courtship was often influenced by seasonal isolation. Winter, in particular, created long periods where families were snowed in, relying on storytelling, weaving, and candle-making to pass the time. In such close quarters, familiarity grew quickly. Matches were often arranged by proximity, the neighboring farm's eldest son and daughter, and reinforced by centuries of shared ancestry. While the choices were few, the bonds formed through hardship and shared labor often proved resilient. Gifts of carved wood, woven belts, or homemade candles served as courtship tokens, and shared winter tasks. Shoveling snow, chopping wood, preparing dried herbs, became quiet acts of courtship in their own right. What ties all these regional customs together is not their form, but their function, whether expressed through dances, tokens, storytelling, or silent gestures. Each tradition served the same purpose: to allow two people to begin the slow and often uncertain journey toward partnership. The variations reflect the terrain, the language, the spiritual beliefs, and the economic structures of each region. But behind the customs lay the same human hopes: a desire to be seen, to be chosen, and to find warmth in a world that was often cold and unpredictable. These rituals also reveal something else: that love, even when constrained by duty and shaped by custom, has always found ways to adapt. It has been expressed in the calloused hands of a farm boy offering his only carving, in the embroidered initials stitched onto a handkerchief by a hopeful girl, in the echo of footsteps on a snowy path, where one person waits and the other dares to arrive. Across medieval Europe, from coastal harbors to mountain valleys, courtship rituals formed the quiet architecture of society, not only structuring marriage, but shaping how people approached trust, commitment, and tenderness. And in those varied, often humble expressions, we are reminded that love is not just a feeling, but a practice. One repeated, region by region, generation by generation, in the quiet language of shared human longing. In medieval Europe, few forces shaped love and marriage more deeply than religion. The Christian Church, as both spiritual guide and earthly authority, did not merely bless unions, it defined their legitimacy, governed their rituals, and dictated their moral contours. From the pulpit and the confessional, from parchment decrees and whispered sermons, it offered instruction not only on what marriage should be, but what love itself was allowed to look like. While local customs and family interests certainly played significant roles in the matchmaking process, it was ultimately the church that stood as arbiter, deciding who could marry, when, how, and why. And through this long reach, religion touched even the quietest corners of affection, weaving sacred expectation into the very heart of courtship and union. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the Catholic Church had firmly established marriage as one of the 7 holy sacraments, a sacred and binding covenant meant not only for companionship or procreation, but for the spiritual good of both husband and wife. This theological framing set it apart from earlier, more transactional or tribal conceptions of partnership, where once a wedding might have simply been a contract between families, overseen by elders or sealed with gifts. It was now something deeper. A divine promise entered into with the blessing of God and the oversight of the clergy. This did not immediately erase the influence of social or economic concerns, but it reframed them within a spiritual lens. Parents might still arrange marriages for land, titles, or wealth, but they did so with the understanding that the church must recognize the match and witness the vows for it to carry full weight. The church's insistence on mutual consent was, in theory, a revolutionary safeguard, one that offered women, especially, a small degree of protection. No union was to be valid unless both parties freely agreed, without force or coercion. However, in practice, this ideal was often compromised by familial pressure, community expectation, and the power imbalance between men and women. A nod under threat or silence born from fear could be interpreted as agreement. Still, the principle of consent remained a powerful idea, one that priests sometimes invoked in defense of girls resisting unwanted marriages, or in adjudicating disputes where one party claimed the other had never truly consented. In ecclesiastical courts, cases involving secret marriages, broken betrothals, and disputed promises were common, and the testimony of both bride and groom was considered, though rarely without bias. The church also prescribed the conditions under which marriage could occur. Weddings could not be held during certain holy seasons, such as Lent or Advent, when fasting and reflection were expected. Degrees of kinship were closely regulated. Individuals could not marry close cousins or those connected by spiritual ties. These restrictions, grounded in canon law, were meant to protect the sanctity of the sacrament and prevent complications of inheritance or moral confusion. In villages and towns, priests were tasked with reading the banns, public announcements of a couple's intention to marry, on 3 consecutive Sundays. This practice, designed to uncover any hidden objections or existing vows, added another layer of public accountability to the process. Confession and penance also played roles in shaping the moral landscape of love and dating. From a young age, Christians were taught to confess sins of the heart, lustful thoughts, impure actions, inappropriate attachments. For many, especially the devout or the uncertain, romantic attraction became a source of anxiety, something to be monitored and restrained rather than explored. Priests offered guidance, sometimes gentle, sometimes severe, on how to manage these feelings. They advised young people to avoid temptation, to pray for clarity, to refrain from prolonged glances or idle chatter with the opposite sex. In this way, religious instruction extended beyond the confessional and into the realm of daily behavior, creating a culture where emotional expression was tightly bound by notions of virtue and sin. Yet for all its caution, the Church also recognized the potential beauty of love within marriage. Christian doctrine celebrated the idea of marital fidelity, mutual support, and the raising of children in faith. The Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph, while not a traditional married couple in the romantic sense, were often held up as models of trust and shared devotion. St. Paul's letters to early Christian communities were frequently quoted in sermons, emphasizing that husbands should love their wives as Christ loved the Church, selflessly, patiently, and without cruelty. These ideals offered comfort to many couples, suggesting that affection, Even passion could have a sacred dimension if it was guided by commitment and humility. In monastic communities, where vows of celibacy precluded romantic entanglement, the discussion of love took on a different tone. Monks and nuns were taught to redirect their emotional energies toward God, to love with a purity that transcended the physical, and yet, within these cloistered walls, human longing did not vanish. Letters from medieval monasteries revealed deeply personal expressions of attachment between monks and their superiors, between nuns and the saints they admired, even between religious siblings separated by distance. These relationships, while not romantic in the secular sense, demonstrate the enduring human need for connection, and the way religious life rechanneled that need into spiritual devotion. For the laity, saints' lives and miracle stories also influenced how people understood love. Hagiographies, the biographies of saints, often included accounts of divine matchmaking, miraculous interventions in troubled marriages, or chastity preserved against all odds. These stories were not merely entertainment. They offered models of virtue, warning against lust and praising fidelity, patience, and pious. Some saints, like Saint Agnes or Saint Cecilia, became patrons of young girls, invoked for protection against unwanted suitors, or for strength in remaining pure. Others, like Saint Valentine, whose association with romantic love would grow much later, were remembered for their defense of true union, even in the face of persecution. These narratives shaped how people thought about affection, turning even the desire to love into a moral challenge. Pilgrimage, too, had religious dimensions that touched on courtship. While most pilgrims journeyed for healing, forgiveness, or penance, many encountered fellow travelers along the way, and in some cases, romantic bonds emerged from these shared experiences. The Church, wary of distraction or impropriety, warned against such attachments. Yet pilgrims who met along the road, especially those whose stations or intentions aligned, sometimes saw their meeting as providential, a gift from God. If they eventually married, their union might be remembered as spiritually blessed, rooted in shared devotion and mutual humility. Religious festivals also created rare opportunities for young people to mingle under the Church's watchful eye. Feast days, especially those honoring local patron saints, often included processions, games, and communal meals. While primarily devotional, these events allowed boys and girls, men and women, to spend time together in public, with less suspicion than usual. These moments, a shared drink at a fair, a laugh during a foot race, a hymn sung side by side. Though the Church emphasized moderation and chastity during these festivals, it also understood their social function and often worked alongside communities to ensure that proper conduct was observed without extinguishing joy. Marriage itself, as a sacrament, was celebrated with particular liturgical solemnity. In many regions, the wedding ceremony began at the church door, symbolizing the threshold between individual lives and shared spiritual union. The couple, standing before witnesses and under the guidance of the priest, would exchange vows, often in the vernacular language, making clear their intention to remain faithful and to accept the duties of married life. The priest would then bless the union, and sometimes the couple would enter the church for a mass or receive the Eucharist together, a sign of their shared journey in Christ. This ceremony, though simple by modern standards, carried deep theological meaning. It marked not only the start of a household, but the creation of a new cell within the body of Christ, a partnership bound not only by law or custom, but by divine promise. Over time, as theological debates continued and canon law evolved, the Church refined its positions on love and marriage. Councils were held, treatises were written, and moral guides for confessors became more detailed. By the later Middle Ages, a complex moral vocabulary had developed around courtship, one that included concepts like near occasions of sin, purity of intention, and spiritual compatibility. These ideas trickled down into popular sermons, shaping how parents advised their children and how individuals assessed their own hearts. While the strictness of these teachings varied from region to region, and from priest to priest, they created a shared moral framework within which medieval people navigated the uncertain waters of desire, commitment, and faith. Yet even within this rigid structure, contradictions abounded. The Church encouraged marital affection, but warned against sensual indulgence. It praised virginity, but relied on reproduction. It celebrated love, but distrusted passion. And so, ordinary people learned to balance to find room for feeling within the walls of duty, to whisper prayers between moments of longing, and to trust that even quiet affection could be sacred when offered in honesty and humility. In the end, the Church's influence on dating and marriage was neither wholly oppressive nor wholly liberating. It offered structure where chaos might have reigned. It offered dignity to unions that might otherwise have been purely transactional. But it also imposed restrictions that sometimes silenced the heart. And in that tension, between spirit and flesh, between duty and desire, medieval love found its shape. Not always free, not always fair, but always watched, always weighed, and always touched by the hope that somewhere, beneath the rules and robes and rituals, a quiet, honest love might still be blessed. In a time when words were often measured, and emotions guarded with care, the act of giving a gift became one of the most powerful expressions of affection in the medieval world. Long before the invention of modern jewelry stores or mass-produced valentines, love was communicated through items both humble and meaningful. A ribbon carefully knotted, a carving shaped by hand, a flower offered in silence. These objects, though modest by modern standards, carried deep symbolic weight. They were the physical language of medieval courtship, a way for individuals to say what they could not speak, to reach across the barriers of class, custom, or caution with something tangible, something chosen. Whether offered in secrecy or celebration, gifts and tokens served as subtle yet profound messengers of intent, interest, or deepening affection. Among the peasant class, where wealth was scarce and most possessions had practical purposes, romantic gifts were often handmade. A boy might carve a spoon or a comb from wood, using spare hours between chores to smooth the edges and add simple patterns. A girl might embroider a handkerchief with her initials, or stitch a small cloth pouch filled with dried herbs meant to bring comfort or good fortune. These items, though not extravagant, were rich with care. They required time, thought, and intention, a kind of investment more sincere than gold. In many rural communities, such gifts would be exchanged quietly, sometimes at night, sometimes beneath the trees at the edge of a field, where only the birds and wind bore witness. In towns and growing cities, where markets and guilds offered greater access to materials, gifts became more varied. A suitor might purchase a ribbon from a merchant stall, dyed in rare colors, imported from far-off looms, and presented folded neatly in a pouch. Others might offer pins, buttons, or tokens made of bone or pewter. Among apprentices, who often had little money but great skill, the gift itself became a display of promise. A blacksmith's apprentice might forge a pendant in the shape of a heart or hammer out a brooch bearing a secret symbol. A weaver might present a scrap of fine linen or a woven band meant to be worn under the tunic, close to the skin. These gifts were not merely tokens. They were demonstrations of ability, hints at future prosperity, quiet declarations of readiness. In noble circles, gift-giving took on more elaborate forms, guided by protocol, expectation, and the constant performance of status. Courtly love, that stylized tradition of unattainable longing sung about by troubadours and minstrels, often involved elaborate exchanges of objects meant to signify fidelity, devotion, and idealized admiration. A knight might dedicate a piece of his armor, a glove, a sash, or a token worn at his breast, to a noble lady during a tournament. In return, she might send a handkerchief embroidered with her coat of arms or a token blessed by a priest. These gifts were often ceremonial, more symbolic than sincere, but not always without feeling. Within the constraints of courtly ritual, true affection sometimes stirred, and when it did, the exchange of objects became more personal. A ring engraved with initials, a lock of hair sealed in a pendant, a pair of gloves scented with oil and wrapped in soft cloth. These were not thrown from balconies or dropped carelessly at feasts. They were carried, hidden, and treasured, often for a lifetime. Across Europe, certain objects developed consistent meanings. A belt, for instance, might represent loyalty or service, a symbol that the giver was willing to bind themselves to the beloved. A mirror, though rare and expensive, suggested admiration, a way of saying, "This is how I see you." Apples were given to express desire or admiration of beauty, while nuts and dried fruits, often wrapped in cloth, symbolized fertility or hope for a bountiful future. Flowers held a special place in many regions. Though not yet as codified as in later centuries, certain blossoms carried consistent associations. Roses for love, rosemary for remembrance, violets for modesty, daisies for innocence. The act of choosing a flower and presenting it, even without words, could carry an entire conversation between two people not allowed to speak freely. Timing and method of delivery also mattered. A gift left on a doorstep, tucked into a basket of firewood, or hidden beneath a girl's spindle was understood to be romantic in nature. The secrecy added to the thrill. In some villages, gifts were exchanged during festivals or specific times of the year thought to hold romantic significance. May Day was especially popular, a time when young people might leave tokens outside the homes of those they admired, often before sunrise, to avoid being seen. In return, the recipient might place a ribbon in her window or wear the gift during the celebration, indicating acceptance or interest. These rituals were often informal and varied by region, but they provided structure and safety to expressions of affection, especially for those not yet formally betrothed. The act of giving also created risk. A gift could be refused, ignored, or mocked. In tight-knit communities, such rejections could be devastating, not only to the heart, but to the giver's reputation. For women, the acceptance of a gift was sometimes interpreted as a promise, and if the relationship soured, she might be accused of misleading the suitor. For men, a poorly chosen or ill-timed gift could be seen as presumptuous or disrespectful. The social rules surrounding gift-giving were rarely written down, but everyone understood them. Even the smallest offering carried weight, not only between the giver and recipient, but within the wider circle of family, neighbors, and watchful eyes. Among married couples, gifts continued to play a role, though they were often practical. A husband might bring home a new cooking pot, not simply as a household tool, but as a gesture of appreciation. A wife might surprise her husband with a cloak she had woven or a pair of shoes mended with extra care. These gifts did not announce themselves as romantic, but they conveyed affection nonetheless, a kind of everyday love, expressed through service and thoughtfulness. For couples who had grown close over years of shared work and quiet companionship, such offerings were not symbolic so much as deeply personal. The pot meant fewer cold meals. The cloak meant fewer shivers on the road. In these gestures, love became part of the daily fabric, unspoken but deeply understood. Religious tokens also made their way into romantic exchange. A pilgrim badge from a distant shrine, a prayer card pressed between the pages of a book, a relic, real or imagined, tied into a ribbon. These objects suggested not only affection but spiritual concern, a desire for the beloved's protection, salvation, or healing. To give a religious token was to express care that extended beyond this life, to show not only love, but faith. In some cases, couples who could not be together due to distance, disapproval, or war, would send such items as a reminder that their bond endured despite separation. These were not grand statements, but quiet threads tying hearts together across time and space. In many cases, gifts served as a prelude to formal betrothal. A boy might carve a ring from bone and present it as a promise, not legally binding, but emotionally significant. A girl might give a part of her dowry chest, a fine linen towel, or a braid of her own hair wrapped in cloth, as a way of saying that her future was open to the suitor's presence. These gestures, while intimate, were often witnessed by family or friends, anchoring them within the safety of community. Though love was personal, it was never private in the medieval world. Even the most tender exchanges were understood to carry implications far beyond the two individuals involved. In situations where a relationship ended, whether by choice, obligation, or misfortune, gifts often became painful reminders. A ribbon once worn daily might be hidden away. A carving might be burned, broken, or returned. In some communities, there were rituals for disposing of tokens from a lost or forbidden love, burying them under stones, tossing them into rivers, or tying them to trees at the edge of the village. These acts, while symbolic, helped the heart to release what it could not hold. They were the silent goodbyes of a world where spoken farewell was sometimes too dangerous or too final. In rare cases, gifts took on legendary proportions. Ballads and folk tales told of knights who wore a lady's glove into battle, of girls who waited by the sea with a ribbon given years before, of simple trinkets that became talismans of impossible love. These stories, passed from mouth to mouth, imbued the act of giving with mythic resonance. The message was clear. Even the smallest object, given with honest feeling, could carry the weight of an entire world. Looking back, it becomes clear that medieval love was never entirely silent. It simply spoke a different language. It spoke in stitches and splinters, in pressed flowers and folded cloth. It spoke in gifts to humble, to sell, and to sacred, to discard. And through these offerings, given with trembling hands or steady purpose, people shaped their feelings into form, made their intentions visible, and left traces of themselves in the hands of those they longed to reach. In a medieval world so often marked by toil, restraint, and tradition, festivals stood out as rare moments of celebration, bursts of color and music in the midst of seasons, defined by labor and repetition. These were the times when the calendar softened, when the rigid rules of daily conduct were relaxed, just enough to allow joy to unfold. For the young, especially those on the cusp of adulthood, festivals were among the few socially sanctioned opportunities to mingle, to notice, and to be noticed. These were the moments when courtship could unfold in daylight, in plain sight, yet softened by laughter and song. Though framed as religious observances or agricultural rites, festivals in medieval Europe were, in practice, rich with social within their games, dances, and rituals lived the subtle choreography of affection, the shared glances, the deliberate gestures, the beginnings of what might become a lifelong bond. The medieval calendar was shaped around feast days and holy observances, saints' days, harvest festivals, and religious celebrations such as Candlemas and the Feast of Corpus Christi created predictable rhythms throughout the year. While many of these were rooted in devotion, their observance in towns and villages quickly became communal affairs, marked by processions, meals, outdoor gatherings, and games. During these events, young people, often otherwise separated by strict gender norms, were allowed to participate in shared activities. These ranged from singing and storytelling to competitions in strength or agility. It was understood that such occasions, while not explicitly about courtship, offered a chance for social interaction, and that within this interaction, romantic possibilities might quietly emerge. One of the most anticipated festivals, especially in Northern Europe, was May Day, celebrated on the 1st of May. This springtime ritual honored fertility, the rebirth of nature, and the warming of the earth. Villagers would erect maypoles adorned with flowers and colored ribbons, around which boys and girls would dance in spiraling patterns. In some regions, the night before May Day was marked by the tradition of going a-maying, where groups of youths ventured into the woods to gather flowers, often returning at sunrise to decorate their homes and village green. Though officially innocent, this tradition carried romantic implications. Couples might steal away from the group, walking together beneath budding branches, their steps slowed by the softness of moss and early morning dew. These were moments of quiet togetherness, cloaked in the acceptable garb of celebration, yet filled with possibility. Songs, too, played a central role in medieval festivals, and in the courtship process more broadly. Music was not simply entertainment, it was memory, emotion, and communication. Folk ballads, often passed orally through generations, told stories of love gained and lost, of longing, betrayal, and loyalty. These songs, sung in groups, or by solo performers, shaped how people understood romance. A girl might hum a tune about a sailor's promise. A boy might whistle a melody about a maiden waiting at the well. The lyrics were familiar, the tunes shared, but the feelings were deeply personal. Singing together at a festival, especially during the slow, mournful songs, allowed for the expression of emotion in a public yet protected space. It was acceptable to be moved, to feel, to let the words speak what one's own voice could not. In many regions, traditional dances were organized specifically for young people of marriageable age. These dances, sometimes called ring dances, sometimes processional or were carefully choreographed to ensure social decorum, while still allowing for interaction. Partners would be rotated throughout the dance, giving everyone a chance to participate. Eye contact, hand-holding, and synchronized movement offered a form of physical closeness that was otherwise rare. A shared smile, a whispered line of the song, a gentle grip during a turn. These gestures became laden with meaning, and because everyone was watching, they also served as subtle declarations. A dance shared with care and consistency might lead to an invitation to walk together after the festival or a request to visit during a family meal. In this way, dance was not only art, but language, a means of negotiating attraction within the boundaries of custom. Some dances and songs were regional and specific. In the Basque country, couples danced mutsaika with distinct footwork and rhythm, often in village squares. In Germany, Schuhplattler evolved into a boisterous courtship dance, where men showed off their agility and strength through rhythmic slapping and stamping, while women watched and smiled. In southern France, troubadours' lyrical poetry was set to music and often performed in courts and festivals, blending high art with personal sentiment. These regional variations reflected local culture, but all served the same essential purpose. They created a socially acceptable space for romance to emerge in public view, under the gentle gaze of community rather than the harsh spotlight of judgment. Beyond the structure of dances and songs, festivals were filled with symbols and rituals that allowed for expressions of interest. A flower offered after a dance, a cake shared between partners, a ribbon tied around a wrist or ankle, exchanged at the end of the day. In some regions, games were played where tokens of affection were given as prizes. A girl might win a hand-embroidered cloth from a boy who excelled at archery. A boy might receive a ribbon woven with a girl's name if he carried her across a stream without dropping her. These acts, while playful on the surface, were rich with social subtext. They gave young people the chance to demonstrate virtue, humor, strength, and kindness, all qualities that would be considered in the unspoken evaluation of a potential spouse. It was during these gatherings that stories were told, both real and imagined, about who liked whom, who might be betrothed, who was still available. Elders watched carefully, not only for misbehavior, but for promising interactions. A mother might whisper to a neighbor about how gently a boy helped her daughter tie her shoe. A father might quietly approve of a young man who shared his bread rather than boast about his hunting skills. These observations would be remembered, discussed over meals, and sometimes used as starting points for formal courtship arrangements. Thus, festivals were not simply joyful occasions. They were scouting grounds, opportunities for families to glimpse future alliances forming before any official agreement had been made. In more rural or isolated regions, festivals were sometimes the only chance for young people to meet others outside their own village. This made them especially important for those who lived far from bustling towns or trading centers. A girl who had never seen beyond her valley might meet a boy from across the river. A shepherd might dance with a miller's daughter and discover in her smile a softness that stayed with him through winter. These meetings did not always lead to marriage. Sometimes they were brief, sweet, and never repeated, but they added texture to the otherwise repetitive cycle of life, reminding people that the world was larger than their chores, and their chores were not all there was. Even when courtship did not begin at a festival, many couples held their betrothal ceremonies or weddings during these times, aligning their personal joy with a communal calendar. A wedding during harvest meant help with food. A betrothal on a saint's day meant spiritual blessing. A festival wedding gave the community reason to celebrate, and neighbors would bring gifts of grain, cloth, or cheese to mark the union. These public celebrations reinforced the idea that love, while personal, belonged also to the larger social body. A marriage was not simply two people joining, but to families, to households, and, in a sense, the village itself. As the sun set on festival days, and the candles were lit in doorways and windows, the music often softened into lullabies and farewell songs. Couples walked home slowly, hands sometimes brushing, voices lowered. For some, this was the end of a lovely day, and nothing more. For others, it marked the beginning of something hoped for, something just beginning to unfold. In these quiet transitions, from light to dark, from music to silence, from crowd to solitude, through festivals, dances, and songs, the medieval world made space for love within the constraints of structure and expectation. These moments offered permission to speak, to move, to notice, and within that permission, people reached for one another with hope and courage. The gestures were small, the risks sometimes large, but the desire was always the same. To find someone who saw them, who heard them, who might one day sit beside them not only at a festival, but in the long, ordinary days that followed. And in that search, beneath the ribbons and bells and music, a timeless human truth unfolded. That joy, shared in even the briefest moment, might one day grow into something lasting. For all the rules, rituals, and traditions that shaped medieval dating and marriage, not all love could be sanctioned. In a world where unions were arranged, where class and custom dictated who could love whom and when, not every heart followed the prescribed path. Some affections grew in secret, away from the eyes of priests and parents. Others bloomed boldly despite the threat of scandal or punishment. These were the forbidden loves, whispered about behind doors, recorded in court documents, and immortalized in song and legend. And while they may have disrupted the social order, they revealed something eternal, that love, when it comes, does not always ask permission. One of the most common and dangerous forms of forbidden love in medieval society was that which crossed the boundaries of class. A noble falling in love with a servant, a merchant's daughter eloping with a stable hand, a lady of the manor exchanging glances with a traveling minstrel. These stories were not only disapproved of, they were often unthinkable. Marriages, especially among the upper classes, were strategic tools used to secure alliances, land, and political power. Love had little place in these arrangements. To fall for someone beneath one's station was seen not just as folly, but as a betrayal of one's family and duty. And yet, these stories occurred again and again, in castles and villages alike, because proximity and familiarity often gave rise to emotion. A lady might find in her chambermaid's brother a gentleness she had never known in the noblemen around her. A knight might admire the courage of a peasant girl who nursed his wounds after battle. These quiet, forbidden romances were rarely rewarded. If discovered, they led to disgrace, dismissal, or worse. But still they bloomed, delicate and defiant, in the shadows. There were also the loves that defied religious vows. Monks and nuns, bound by celibacy and devotion to God, were expected to forsake earthly attachment. And yet, they were still human. They felt loneliness, affection, longing, the same as anyone else. Letters from monasteries, confessions before ecclesiastical courts, and records of excommunication all testify to the reality of secret liaisons behind cloistered walls. Sometimes it was a priest who fell in love with a widow in his parish. Sometimes it was to members of a religious order who found in each other a solace that prayer could not provide. These relationships, often conducted in secrecy and shame, reveal the tension between human need and spiritual discipline. The Church dealt with such transgressions firmly, through punishment, reassignment, or penance. But the stories remained, hidden in margins, whispered in corridors. They reminded everyone that even the most devout were not immune to love's pull. Perhaps the most scandalous forbidden love of the medieval world was that involving adultery. While marriage was considered sacred, it was not always emotionally fulfilling, especially when arranged without consideration for affection. In such cases, individuals sometimes sought comfort elsewhere. For women, this was especially dangerous. A wife caught in an affair could face public humiliation, physical punishment, or even death. Her lover, if of lower status, might be banished, fined, or beaten. For men, the consequences were often lighter, though not non-existent. Adultery was considered a sin and a threat to the moral fabric of society, and when discovered, it often led to severe legal or ecclesiastical consequences. Despite the risks, however, stories of secret meetings, hidden letters, and midnight rendezvous appear throughout medieval literature and historical record. Sometimes these relationships were passionate, sometimes they were fleeting, but always they revealed the hunger for connection in a world where love was often constrained. There were also forbidden loves born of political strife. In regions torn by clan rivalries, feuds, or war, fall in love with someone from the enemy family could ignite a scandal that reached far beyond the couple. The tale of Romeo and Juliet, though dramatized later, echoes very real medieval anxieties. A girl from one village falling in love with a boy from another, especially one whose family was engaged in a land dispute or past violence, could bring shame or even bloodshed. These romances, filled with tension and risk, were often carried out in absolute secrecy. Meetings at the riverbank, letters sent by trusted friends, or tokens exchanged under the guise of festival gifts. Each act was a gamble, and yet the feelings were often sincere. Love, in such cases, was not just a personal matter. It became political, dangerous, and tragically thrilling. Some of the most deeply hidden loves were those that defied societal norms entirely. Relationships between individuals of the same sex. While medieval Europe was shaped by a rigid religious and legal framework that condemned same-gender intimacy, historical evidence suggests that such relationships existed nonetheless, often under layers of secrecy, coded language, or spiritual friendship. In some monasteries, close bonds between monks were described in emotional and poetic terms. Letters survive that suggest romantic attachment, though cloaked in religious metaphors. In royal courts, accusations of sodomy were sometimes used to discredit political rivals, suggesting that the existence of same-sex love, while hidden, was understood and feared. These relationships, when genuine, required incredible bravery. There were no public models, no path to acceptance, and yet people still found one another, in silence, in risk, in hope. Literature from the time also reflects society's fascination with forbidden love. The tales of Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, and countless other doomed couples reveal how deeply these themes resonated. These stories were copied by hand, sung by minstrels, and passed from generation to generation. While they often ended in tragedy, they also celebrated the power of love to transcend duty, danger, and death. For medieval audiences, these tales served as both cautionary examples and emotional release, a way to explore what could not be spoken aloud, a mirror for secret longing. Even within ordinary marriages, not all forbidden love involved illicit affairs. Sometimes it was as simple as loving someone one could not reach, a servant admiring the daughter of his lord, a merchant's son watching a nun walk silently to chapel. These were loves never acted upon, never spoken, and yet powerful in their own quiet way. The ache of the unattainable, the pull of the impossible. These feelings were deeply human, and they shaped the emotional landscape of countless medieval lives. Punishments for forbidden love varied widely. Ecclesiastical courts handled cases of adultery, betrothal disputes, and clandestine marriages. Penances could include public confession, fines, pilgrimage, or temporary separation. In some regions, community shaming rituals were enacted. A woman might be paraded through the town in her shift, a man forced to perform labor for the church. In more severe cases, especially where noble reputation was involved, imprisonment or exile might result. These punishments were not just about morality. They were about control, ensuring that love remained within the bounds of order, hierarchy, and tradition. And yet, despite the risks, forbidden love persisted. It slipped between the cracks of doctrine and duty. It found refuge in the woods, in the marketplace, in the back pew of a silent church. It spoke through glances, through gifts, through gestures too small to punish. These relationships, though rarely recorded with sympathy, reveal the resilience of the human heart. In a world that tried to script every bond, people still wrote their own lines. Brief, hidden, but unforgettable. Even centuries later, the echo of these stories remains, in castle ruins and monastery records. In ballads half remembered, in poems scratched into the margins of psalters, we find fragments of these quiet rebellions. They remind us that love, though shaped by its time, is never entirely contained. It pushes outward, it searches, it defies, and in that defiance, even when brief or broken, it leaves behind something enduring, a trace of longing, of courage, of the timeless hope that someone, somewhere, might feel the same. In the medieval world, where life was often cut short by illness, war, or accident, love did not always end with death, nor did it always begin in youth. Widowhood, far from being the quiet end of romantic life, marked a complex and often delicate chapter in the story of dating and marriage. For some, it meant grief and solitude. For others, it became a second beginning, a chance to choose with the heart what had once been chosen for them by duty or arrangement, whether prompted by affection, necessity, or both. Remarriage among widows and widowers reveals a side of medieval romance that is often overlooked, one rooted not in first glances and stolen dances, but in memory, resilience, and the enduring human need for companionship. The loss of a spouse was not rare in medieval times. Life expectancy, particularly for men involved in war or trade and women during childbirth, was limited. A man might bury his first wife before he reached 30, while a woman might find herself widowed with children still clinging to her skirt. In such cases, the question of remarriage was not merely emotional, it was often economic. A widow with land but no husband might struggle to maintain her property. A widower with children needed a partner to manage the household and ensure stability. In this context, remarriage was frequently encouraged, especially among the lower and middle classes. It offered protection, continuity, and survival. For noble families, the situation was more layered. Marriage among the aristocracy was as much a political arrangement as a personal bond. The death of a spouse could shift alliances, disrupt inheritances, or open new opportunities. Widows of noble birth often had their future mapped out almost immediately, with families negotiating new matches that would serve their interests. Yet not all noble widows went willingly into second unions. Some, particularly those who had borne children and secured dowries, chose to remain single, managing estates, entering convents, or simply enjoying a degree of independence, rare for women of their station. In these cases, love might play a larger role than before. If they remarried, it was sometimes with greater personal choice, having fulfilled the duties expected of them earlier in life. In towns and villages, widowhood often altered a woman's social standing. A young widow, particularly one with some inheritance, became an object of interest to men seeking stable, experienced partners. Unlike virgins, widows were often seen as practical, familiar with household management, less bound by youthful idealism, and sometimes more willing to remarry out of shared understanding rather than romantic fantasy. Courtship in these cases might begin not with flirtation, but with neighborly help. A man chopping firewood, offering grain, or repairing part of a cottage. These small acts, seemingly mundane, signaled care and reliability, traits more valuable than grand gestures in a world that prized function as much as feeling. Love between widows and widowers could unfold slowly. It might start with shared grief, memories exchanged over a candlelit meal, stories told about those they had lost. There was often a gentleness in such courtships, a tenderness born of experience. These were not the breathless romances of youth, but steady, deliberate unions built on the knowledge of what marriage truly entailed. In some cases, the couple had known each other before, neighbors, friends, fellow parishioners, their paths crossing 4 years before widowhood opened the door to something more. When they did decide to marry, it was often with the quiet blessing of their community. There were fewer rules, fewer expectations, and in that space, a deeper kind of affection could take root. The church's stance on remarriage was cautious but permissive. While marriage was a sacred bond, it was understood that death dissolved it. The Apostle Paul had written that widows were free to remarry if they wished, and this view was generally upheld. However, repeated remarriage, especially for women, was sometimes frowned upon. A widow who had married 3 or more times might be viewed with suspicion, her motives questioned. Still, no canon law forbade multiple remarriages, and for many, the decision was personal. Clergy sometimes encouraged remarriage as a way to avoid loneliness or temptation. Others emphasized the virtues of remaining single, especially for women of means. In either case, the decision reflected both spiritual and worldly concerns, a balance between personal healing and societal expectation. Legal matters often shaped the process. A widow's rights depended heavily on her dowry, her husband's will, and local customs. In some regions, she retained full control of her husband's property until death or remarriage. In others, she was required to return portions to her husband's family if she chose to marry again. These financial concerns were not trivial. They influenced who a widow might consider as a partner, whether she could afford to wait, and what kind of courtship she might permit. A man without resources might hesitate to pursue a widow with land, fearing he could not support her or that her family would object. Likewise, a widow with children had to consider how a new husband would treat them, whether he would act as guardian, rival, or intruder. Despite these obstacles, love did sometimes guide. Ballads from the time speak of widows who remarried out of passion, not need, of men who waited patiently for the morning veil to lift. These songs, often sung at winter gatherings, or by firelight, offered listeners the comfort of imagining that love could be rekindled, even after loss. They reminded people that the heart did not stop feeling simply because it had once broken. In fact, it might love more deeply for having known grief. Among the elderly, companionship often took precedence over romance. An older couple marrying in the later years of life was not seeking fertility or economic alliance, but comfort, understanding, and shared memory. These unions, though quieter, were often deeply respected. They stood as proof that love was not limited to the young, that affection could grow slowly, steadily, like ivy on a stone wall. Villagers might smile to see 2 gray heads walking side by side to mass, or sharing a bench at sunset. In such cases, love was not declared, it was lived. In the way one handed the other a cup, in the shared silence after prayers, in the gentle laughter that came from having nothing to prove. For those who chose not to remarry, widowhood could still hold love. Love for the departed, preserved in memory. Some wore mourning clothes for life. Others kept a lock of hair in a locket, a carved spoon in a drawer, a song in the back of the throat that no longer needed to be sung aloud. These acts of remembrance were private, sometimes unnoticed by others, but they spoke to the depth of bonds formed in a time when marriage was both duty and devotion. In monasteries and convents, widowhood often marked the beginning of religious life. Women, free from the obligations of marriage and motherhood, entered holy orders to live in contemplation and prayer. There, they found community, purpose, and in some cases a new kind of love. The love of sisters, the love of service, the love of a God who asked for nothing but presence. These widows were not forgotten. Their prayers were considered powerful, their wisdom sought, and though they wore no rings, they were often described as brides of Christ, a phrase that, while symbolic, reflected a genuine transformation of devotion. In cities, widowhood offered a kind of freedom. Women could run businesses, enter contracts, and manage property in ways that unmarried women and wives often could not. This independence sometimes drew suitors, but not always. Many widows relished their autonomy, choosing to remain single rather than risk a second marriage that might limit their voice. Their strength lay not in love avoided, but in love understood. A love that included self, community, and purpose. Throughout the medieval world, widowhood was a turning point. It could mark the end of one life and the beginning of another. Whether filled with sorrow, hope, or quiet endurance, it reshaped the way people understood connection. It reminded them that love did not belong only to the young, the beautiful, or the newly met. It could belong also to those who had known loss, who had endured winter, and who still found, in the quiet moments of mourning or the soft closing of a door, the courage to open their hearts once more. As the sun dipped below the thatched rooftops and the smoke of evening hearths curled into the dusky sky, a different kind of love began to take shape, one less sung about in ballads, less whispered behind closed doors, but no less enduring. It was the quiet love of companionship after the chase, of familiarity after fascination. While much of medieval romance was framed by beginnings, the first glance, the first dance, the first exchange token, many relationships went on to last for years, decades even, enduring the long haul of ordinary life. And in that slow persistence, in the shared labor and laughter and loss, love became something deeper, not dramatic, not idealized, but lived. Marriage in the medieval world was often initiated with purpose and practicality, yet, once the vows were made, the shape that love took was forged over time. There were fields to children to raise, illnesses to endure, and seasons to survive. Couples worked together not only to feed themselves, but to navigate the unrelenting hardships of medieval existence. And within that daily struggle, between kneading dough and repairing roofs, birthing children and burying parents, affection often grew. It might not always be spoken, especially in a world where emotions were governed by reserve and religion, but it showed itself in gestures that required no language. A husband rising early to mend his wife's sandals before she awoke. A wife saving the best portion of meat for her husband's bowl. A couple holding hands beneath a blanket in the winter chill. Not from passion, but from instinctive closeness. These were the signs of long love. Not fiery or sudden, but weathered and warm. And while medieval literature was often preoccupied with the thrill of illicit love or the torment of separation, in the corners of surviving letters, wills, and chronicles, we see glimpses of quieter affections. Men who left everything to their wives, despite custom. Women who requested to be buried beside their husbands, even when small phrases, preserved in dusty documents, revealed tenderness as real and resonant as anything sung by the Church upheld the sanctity of marriage and often framed enduring love as a spiritual ideal. Couples were encouraged to pray together, to attend Mass together, to forgive one another, as Christ forgave. In many sermons and texts, love between husband and wife was compared to the love between the soul and God, enduring patient and tested by hardship. Though this spiritual framing sometimes clashed with the realities of human frustration, it offered couples a framework for persistence. Love was not expected to be easy, it was expected to be faithful. And, in that faithfulness, many found comfort, even if passion had faded. As couples aged, their bond often deepened in a way no courtship could anticipate. Their familiarity became a kind of rhythm, a shared language of glances, tasks, and rituals. The way a wife might always place a second log on the fire when she heard her husband's footsteps. The way a husband always left the stool by the hearth angled slightly, knowing his wife would take her seat there each evening. These small accommodations spoke of knowledge, of intimacy built, not in weeks or months, but over years of shared silence and shared speech. They weathered not only external storms, but internal ones. Disagreements, disappointments, the shifting of expectations. And through it all, the foundation held. Children often came and went, growing, marrying, moving on. Fields might be lost to frost or gained through luck. Illness visited, sometimes stealing a parent or neighbor. Through it all, the couple endured, and when one eventually passed, the grief was often quiet but profound. There are records of widows donating to monasteries for prayers in their husband's name, of men carving inscriptions on their wives' gravestones with words like faithful, beloved, and true. Even when those words were chosen by scribes or priests, they reflected a sentiment shaped over years, not of perfect romance, but of enduring presence. Not all marriages ended in such peace, of course. There were quarrels, betrayals, divisions, but among those who remained together into old age, there was a kind of respect that the community acknowledged. Older couples were often seen as examples, not necessarily of passion, but of survival. They had endured war, famine, plague, childbirth, and loss. They had argued, forgiven, rebuilt, and, in villages where everything was visible, every door left open, every tear seen, people took quiet note of those who stayed by each other's side. These long partnerships also shaped how the next generation viewed love. Children who grew up seeing their parents support each other in small, tireless ways learned that love was less about fluttering hearts and more about kind hands. A daughter might choose a husband not for his charm, but because he reminded her of the father who always came in from the fields with an extra egg or a wildflower. A son might choose a wife not for her dowry, but because she laughed like his mother did when the bread rose properly. In this way, the love that endured in one generation seeded love in the next. Not in declarations, but in examples. In some communities, older couples were honored with public blessings or seats of respect at village festivals. They might be asked to bless newlyweds or share words of wisdom. Their names became associated with the very idea of home. A certain cottage always linked to a certain pair, even after their passing. In this way, their love lingered beyond the flesh, becoming part of the collective memory. Neighbors might say, "That's where old Marta and Henrik lived. They never spent a night apart," or "She still sets 2 plates, even though he's gone these 10 winters." These phrases, spoken casually, were actually quiet tributes, acknowledgments of love that had weathered the years and left a trace. Medieval medicine held few remedies for the ailments of age, but companionship was its own kind of a husband who rubbed his wife's joints with warm oil, a wife who adjusted her husband's cloak when the wind turned. They may not have used the word love as we use it now. It was more often called loyalty, kindness, or piety. But in practice, it was the same. It was choosing each other again, each day, despite the aches, the weariness, the familiarity that could dull or deepen. It was knowing the worst of someone and still tending their cup first at supper. Ultimately, the story of dating in the medieval world does not end with weddings or even with the first few years of marriage. It continues quietly, persistently, in the daily lives of those who built something together, something that could not be sung or danced or gifted, but only lived. It was the love of routine, of patience, of shared history, a love that had seen the best and worst and remained, a love that began, perhaps, in a dance on May Day or a whispered word during harvest, but that found its true shape in the slow passage of time. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval cottage, where a wife folded linens while her husband mended tools, or in the silence of a convent cell, where a widow pressed her hand to a worn piece of cloth, love existed not as a thunderclap, but as a hum, low, steady, continuous, a rhythm beneath the noise of life. And that, perhaps, was the greatest romance of all. And so, our journey comes to a quiet close, through the moonlit meadows and candlelit cottages of a world long gone, where love was found not in fairy tales, but in quiet glances, whispered vows, and the steady rhythm of 2 hearts, weathering time together. We've wandered through moments both tender and bittersweet, discovering that even in the most distant of centuries, the longing to connect, to see and be seen, remained unchanged. If you're still with me, thank you for keeping company through the stillness of night. And if sleep has already gently gathered you in, may your dreams carry you gently through time and memory, where all is calm and nothing is hurried. Until next time, rest well. And so, our journey comes to a quiet close, through the moonlit meadows and candlelit cottages of a world long gone, where love was found not in fairy tales, but in quiet glances, whispered vows, and the steady rhythm of 2 hearts, weathering time together. We've wandered through moments both tender and bittersweet, discovering that even in the most distant of centuries, the longing to connect, to see and be seen, remained unchanged. If you're still with me, Thank you for keeping company through the stillness of night. And if sleep has already gently gathered you in, may your dreams carry you gently through time and memory, where all is calm and nothing is hurried. Until next time, rest well.